Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the world around you fade and picture instead a small town nestled deep in the wooded heart of old Bavaria. The air is cool, scented faintly with pine and damp stone. The rooftops are steep, their wooden beams darkened with time and creaking under slow winds. Church bells ring gently in the distance, but something in the silence feels off. The birds sing less here, doors shut a little faster, and footsteps seem to pause when you walk past. This is not just any Bavarian town. This is a place where fear was law and whispers could ruin lives. A place where neighbors spied through keyholes and dreams were considered dangerous. Tonight, we're going to explore what it might have been like to live in one of Europe's most quietly terrifying places during the height of its witch trial hysteria. You won't need to imagine any flames or flying broomsticks. The real story is quieter, more ordinary, and somehow that makes it even more chilling. We will move gently through the rhythm of peasant life, through real stories of trial and punishment, through the symbols people carved to protect themselves, and finally into the soft, eerie echoes that still live in the forests today. So breathe in slowly and prepare to drift back into a world where trust could kill, and where even gathering wild herbs could be the beginning of the end. Chapter 1, Gathering Herbs While Neighbors Whisper, Segment 1. A peasant woman's daily. Routine spirals as herbal knowledge turns suspicious. Imagine yourself waking just before dawn in a modest wooden cottage on the edge of a dense Bavarian forest. The hearth has long gone cold, but you can still smell yesterday's boiled turnips lingering in the air. Your fingers are stiff from sleep and chill, but you pull on a heavy woolen shawl and step outside. The air is damp and smells faintly of rotting leaves. You walk with purpose, a basket slung over one, and head down a narrow, rutted path toward the woods. This morning, you need yarrow, some mugwort if you can find it, and a handful of fennel seed from the garden. Not for sorcery or spells, of course, but to ease the aching stomach of your neighbor's little boy. You've done this for years, your mother before you too. It's how the women of your family have always helped the village. You know which roots to dry and which flowers to boil. You know the right prayers to whisper, not because they change the herbs, but because people expect them. But lately you've noticed things feel different. The way people watch you when you pass. The way old Frau Gerda crosses herself when you bend to pick flowers near the chapel fence. It started after the miller's daughter died last winter. Fever took her surely. She was always frail, pale even in summer. But someone remembered that you had given her a tea. Someone else remembered that she had stopped by your home on the way to market. And just like that, your name was spoken. Not loudly. Not yet, but softly. Just loud enough to stir suspicion. The town itself isn't large. A cluster of cottages, a small church, and a crooked stone well at the center. People here live close, and privacy is more rumor than reality. It only takes one flicker of uncertainty, one raised eyebrow at a gathering, for fear to catch like dry tinder. So you try to keep your head down. You smile more than you used to. You carry your basket openly, so everyone can see the harmless things you collect. And yet, there are the marks. You find one carved into your doorframe one morning. At first, you think it's just a knotted wood grain. But the shape is too deliberate, too sharp. An inverted cross scraped faintly into the timber. No one saw who did it. No one says a word about it. But now, when you go to draw water from the well, conversations stop. The blacksmith's apprentice, who once courted your daughter, looks away now. And then there are the chickens. One morning they're dead. All of them. Stiff, splayed, eyes blank. It could have been disease. Or rats. Or foxes. But what if someone did this to make it look like you're doing? You bury them in silence and scrub your hands raw in icy water. Still, you continue your work. The neighbor's boy still needs that fennel. And your own joints ache worse each winter. You press forward, though you no longer go to the woods alone. Evening comes quickly in late autumn. Smoke curls from every chimney, and the town is bathed in a dull orange hue. But inside your home, there is no warmth, only quiet tension. Because deep down, you know the truth. That it doesn't matter if you've done anything wrong. What matters is that enough people have decided you could have. And in a town like this, that is sometimes all it takes. You light a single candle, whisper a prayer that isn't quite from scripture, and settle into bed, knowing that in the morning you'll walk the same path again, basket on your arm, with a little more fear than before. The next morning begins like any other, but the wind carries a colder edge. There's frost on the stones outside, spiderwebs turn to threads of glass. You pull your shawl tighter, noticing how your hands are cracking again from the lie soap and the cold. You always wash them thoroughly after handling herbs. You never used to worry who might be watching. But now, each motion feels performative. You pick your way through the garden, pretending not to notice the baker's wife watching from her window. She doesn't wave. She just closes the shutters. Inside, your daughter sits at the hearth, plating dried mint stems for storage. She hums softly, but her eyes flick toward the door too often. Even she can feel the shift in the air. There are no open accusations, not yet. But suspicion has a smell like wet wool and burnt ash, and it clings to your walls. A knock at the door makes both of you start. It's the parish boy, delivering a message. His eyes are wide as he hands you a folded parchment. You nod and thank him, but he runs off without waiting for a reply. That wasn't how he used to act. The message is from the priest. He invites you, kindly of course, to attend a gathering that evening. Nothing formal. Just tea and scripture. An opportunity to show your devotion. You know what it really means? Show up, or you've shown something else. As you prepare, you dress carefully. Nothing too fine, lest someone think you've grown proud or vain. Nothing too poor, either, or they'll say you've been cursed. You settle on a modest brown dress with a blue kerchief, the one your late husband always said made you look trustworthy. The gathering is small. Familiar faces arranged around the long table in the rectory. Tea steams gently in chipped cups, but the warmth doesn't reach past your fingers. The priest reads aloud from Psalms. You nod along, careful to close your eyes for each prayer. Afterward, they serve small slices of oatcake. The room murmurs with pleasantries, but each phrase seems to carry another weight. Frau Sutter remarks how healthy you look, almost too healthy for your age. The priest asks about your herbal knowledge, just idle curiosity, he says. The apothecary's apprentice offers a half smile and comments that your remedies are more effective than medicine, or so people say. They don't say your name with malice. That's not how it works. They simply say it with tone, with implication. That night, you leave early. You don't want to linger. Your daughter doesn't ask how it went. She just sits close by the fire with the family cat, stroking it quietly, eyes on the embers. Days pass. The weather grows worse. Snow starts to gather in gray, uneven piles against the base of cottages. The sky remains the same cold white from dawn to dusk, and your world seems smaller each morning. Then you notice something new. A stone has been left on your doorstep. It's smooth, painted red, with a small slash in the middle. You've seen others like it left outside the homes of those who fell ill, those who later vanished. You tell yourself it's just a prank. Children, perhaps. But when you go to brush it away, your daughter stops you. Her face is pale. She's seen the sign before. The next morning, one of your regulars doesn't arrive. An old man with rheumatism who usually comes weekly for willow bark. You send your daughter to check on him. She returns with a strange expression. He's not sick, but he won't be coming anymore. His daughter won't let him. She says he doesn't need strange herbs anymore. Your daughter says softly, as if quoting. He should pray more instead. You sit down slowly. The heat from the fire does nothing for the cold seeping into your chest. The change is unmistakable now. It's in how the butcher asks you twice what day your hens last laid. It's in how the innkeeper no longer gives you credit. It's in how the town bell rings more often, less for celebration, more for meetings, sermons, and things unspoken. And then, one afternoon, the priest visits your home. In person, his boots are muddy, and his cloak smells faintly of incense. He smiles warmly. But you've seen that kind of smile before. He asks if you're well. He asks if you've had any strange dreams lately. He asks if you've considered attending confession more regularly. You say yes, of course. You've never missed a holy day. But your voice is thin. Before he leaves, he places a hand on your shoulder. His fingers are dry, his touch feather-light. It's always wise, he says, to be transparent in times like these. You nod, unsure what to say. He leaves, his boots crunching softly over the frozen dirt. That evening, your daughter asks if she should stop collecting firewood near the forest. She says she thought she heard someone following her. Not a person, just the feeling of one. You look at her and realize something that hollows your chest. She's afraid not just for you, but of what might happen to her because of you. It's subtle, this kind of unraveling. No one ties you to a stake. No one screams your name. Instead, the fire builds slowly. In conversations, in gestures, in quiet absences. And one morning, when you wake to find that the rope to your chicken coop has been sliced clean, and your basket has been taken from the porch, you understand the truth. They are preparing. Not for your trial. That comes later. They're preparing each other for the idea that you've already been lost. Chapter 2. The Bamberg Witch Trials. The town of Bamberg rests gently in northern Bavaria, its stone streets curling around a winding river, its rooftops huddled like secrets kept closed for centuries. At first glance, it is as picturesque as any postcard of early modern Europe might be. Timber-framed homes, smoke drifting from chimneys, a tall Gothic cathedral with bells that echo across the hills. But in the 1620s, this quiet town held a reputation that chilled even those living miles away. It had become a place where law, religion, and paranoia twisted together into something dangerous. A place where hundreds of people, men, women, even children, were accused, tortured, and executed for witchcraft in one of the largest mass trials in early modern Europe. The roots of the Bamberg witch trials were planted in the soil of larger fears. Europe at the time was cracking under the weight of war, plague, poor harvests, and religious tension. The Holy Roman Empire, within which Bamberg sat, was not so much a single nation as a mosaic of shifting allegiances and fragile powers. The Reformation had torn deep wounds between Catholics and Protestants, and though Bamberg remained Catholic, suspicion hung heavy over anyone seen as spiritually irregular. In this tense environment, Bamberg's Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim saw an opportunity. A devout man, or at least one who appeared so in public. He considered the presence of witches not just a spiritual concern, but a political one. To him, the trials were a kind of purification. A holy service disguised as civic order. He even built a special prison for the accused, a towering stone building ominously nicknamed the Drudenhaus, or Witch House. Inside the Drudenhaus, the process followed a dark logic. A person would be accused, sometimes anonymously, often without cause, and arrested. Interrogations began almost immediately. Torture was not just allowed, but methodically applied. The accused would be asked to name others, and so the list grew. Families crumbled. Neighbors turned against each other. Suspicion became a currency. Records from the time still survive. Neatly written in Gothic script, they include names, confessions, and dates of execution. What makes them chilling is not just the content, but the precision. One might expect madness or chaos in such a setting, but no. The process was bureaucratic, controlled. Take, for instance, the case of Dorothea Flock. She was arrested in April 1630 while pregnant. Her husband, a councilman in Nuremberg, pleaded for her release, even appealing to the emperor himself. But despite this, and despite clear evidence of political pressure, the execution proceeded. Dorothea was tortured, forced to confess, and burned at the stake before the imperial envoy could intervene. Her case sparked outrage across the empire, yet in Bamberg the trials continued. One might ask, how did this happen in such an orderly society? The answer lies in a structure of power. Bamberg's government was not separate from its church. The prince bishop wielded both spiritual and temporal authority. Judges, priests, and civic officials all answered to him. This meant that no higher appeal was possible within the region. But beyond politics, there was something more intimate feeding the fire, a kind of social infection. Once the idea took root that witches were among them, every misfortune could be tied to someone's hidden hand. a hailstorm that ruined crops, a cow that stopped giving milk, a child's persistent illness. In a world without germ theory or climate science, the explanation that someone had cursed you was not just believable, but comforting. It provided a reason and a potential solution. In this way, fear bred more fear. People who had once lived peacefully side by side now looked at each other with narrowed eyes. Wives eyed their husbands. Children listened too carefully to their parents. And those who had little power to begin with, the elderly, the unmarried, the poor, the odd, were the first to fall. There's an eerie symmetry in the language of the court documents. Accusations followed a kind of formula. The accused confessed to flying on broomsticks, attending Sabbaths, or consorting with the devil in the woods. These weren't spontaneous stories. They were shaped under duress, crafted through hours of physical pain and psychological torment. The accused quickly learned what their interrogators wanted to hear. And once they spoke, the damage was irreversible. Maiming others was seen as a sign of repentance. So they named. And the list grew longer. The town of Bamberg became a machine, its gears oiled with rumor and confession. Executions took place often enough that townspeople became numb to the spectacle. Some watched. Some avoided the town square entirely, but few spoke out. Silence became its own survival tactic. Occasionally, someone of means or education would raise a concern. A merchant, a nobleman, even a few clergy. But they too learned that resistance could be dangerous. The system did not tolerate hesitation. Those who questioned the trials often found themselves under scrutiny. The trials were not just about punishing sin, they were also about reinforcing order. A kind of sick logic emerged. If you weren't helping to cleanse the town, perhaps you were part of the problem. And so Bamberg, this quiet river-laced town with its cobblestone streets and solemn cathedrals, became a cautionary tale. A place where faith turned rigid and fear became the loudest voice in the room. But what's perhaps most haunting is how ordinary the people were. The prince bishop thought himself righteous. The judges believed they served justice. The townspeople went along not because they were evil, but because they were scared. And when fear is given power, history shows us again and again that almost anyone can become its servant. And yet, despite the horror, the Druden house had fresh straw laid in its cells each morning. The trials had secretaries, clerks, records filed with neat red ribbons. Because in Bamberg, evil did not roar. It whispered, it smiled, it quoted scripture, and it wore the robes of law. If you were arrested during the Bamberg witch trials, the first thing you would lose was your name. You wouldn't be called by your title or trade anymore. You were simply the accused. Your identity would be recorded in a thick ledger beside the word hex witch and assigned a number. It was clean, efficient, and devastating. You would be brought to the Druden house, the stone fortress built specifically for your kind. No one ever called it a prison aloud. That word sounded too blunt. They preferred other terms: sanctuary, inquiry chamber, house of correction. But once inside, it was clear what it truly was. The walls were thick, damp with old moisture. There were barred slits instead of windows. Iron hooks protruded from the walls, and wooden racks were bolted to the floors. You wouldn't be alone, but you wouldn't be allowed to speak either. Silence, both forced and expected, hung heavy in the air. The interrogators came with questions already written down. You were guilty, your answers were only meant to clarify how. No matter how carefully you spoke, your fate had already begun to turn. The moment someone mentioned your name in a whispered conversation, the machinery had started. Torture was not seen as cruelty. It was procedure. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, the empire's legal code, allowed torture under specific conditions, usually if a crime was serious and the suspect's guilt was considered half-proven. But in Bamberg, the threshold for proof was low, and the justifications were flexible. They would begin gently, if one could call it that. Thumbscrews, shackles tightened until blood vessels burst. A device called the Spanish boot wooden blocks placed around the legs, then hammered with wedges until bones splintered. These weren't punishments. They were questions. And every crack of bone was meant to coax a confession. Many victims broke quickly, and who wouldn't? When the pain arrived, the mind searched for any way to make it stop. So they confessed. Some claimed to have flown through the air. Others spoke of Sabbaths in the forest where the devil danced with goats. These were not tales freely told. They were the echoes of previous confessions, the same stories reshaped under different names. And the worst part was that confessing did not mean freedom. It only meant postponement. Once you admitted guilt, you were expected to name others. This was framed as a service, an act of repentance. If you gave enough names, perhaps the church would show mercy, but mercy was a thin veil. In most cases, it simply meant you would be executed more quickly. The stories from these confessions are chilling not because of their content, but because of their sameness. Dozens of people from different villages and backgrounds all repeating nearly identical details. The same hours, the same forest, the same demonic rituals. The court considered this consistency to be proof. But any thinking person today sees it for what it was. A script beaten into memory. What's perhaps more unsettling is how many of the accused came from respected families. In Bamberg, even wealth could not shield you. One of the most notorious examples was that of Katharina Merklerin, the wife of a council member. She was known as generous and pious. She had no enemies, no debts. But someone accused her of bewitching a cow. That's all it took. She was arrested, interrogated, and within weeks executed. Her husband, once a man of stature, could do nothing. In fact, he was arrested next. Their 2 children were taken in by distant relatives who changed their names. Even priests were not immune. One Jesuit was quietly removed from his post after making a comment suggesting the trials had grown excessive. He was later found to have gone mad and was confined to a monastery. The machinery devoured everything. Testimonies from those who survived, or who left records before their execution, speak to the quiet horror of it all. A woman named Maria Weber wrote a short letter to her sister just days before her sentence. In it, she begged her family not to seek revenge. She said only, "Tell them I loved our garden. Tell them I still smell the rosemary." That phrase, "I still smell the rosemary," is now etched on a plaque in modern Bamberg. It's easy to miss, tucked between old buildings and shaded by ivy. But it remains as a gentle echo of those forgotten voices. Some of the accused never screamed during torture, not out of bravery, but because they had simply given up. There are notations in the court books describing prisoners as unmoving, resigned, or delirious. One man, a shoemaker, reportedly began humming hymns during his final interrogation. He died before he reached the pyre. Executions took place in a clearing just beyond the town walls. Fires were lit before dawn. It was done quickly by the standards of the day, but always publicly. Townsfolk were expected to attend. Children were brought to watch, a lesson in obedience. And yet many of those who watched could not meet the accused's eyes. Because in those final moments, when the condemned looked outward from the flames, they saw familiar faces, neighbors, friends, perhaps even the very person who accused them. Sometimes, the only mercy came in the form of unconsciousness. A heavy blow to the head, delivered quietly before the flames rose. Officially, that wasn't allowed. But there are suggestions, hinted at in letters and in priestly confessions, that some executioners broke protocol out of pity. The prince-bishop, meanwhile, maintained his sanctified image. He rarely attended executions. He claimed to be saddened by the necessity of it all, but his courts continued to expand. His prisons grew fuller, and his treasury, fed by the confiscated property of the accused, grew heavy with coin. In the end, it wasn't remorse that slowed the trials. It was imperial intervention, pressure from neighboring territories, concern from the emperor's court, and mounting disgust among Bamberg citizens led to the eventual dismantling of the witch hunt machine. By then, it was too late for over 1,000 people. And when the flames died down and the town began to forget, there was no apology, no reckoning, only silence. But sometimes in winter, the wind still rustles through the alleys of Bamberg in a way that makes you pause. Not quite a scream, not quite a whisper. Just the memory of what happens when fear is given a podium and justice stays quiet. Chapter 3. Hidden Symbols on Church Beams. There are churches in Bavaria that have stood for centuries. Simple stone buildings with worn thresholds and heavy wooden beams. Inside, the air smells faintly of old incense, beeswax, and damp stone. The pews creak, the candles flicker, and if you look closely, really closely, you might notice something curious. Not the paintings, not the altar, but the beams. Specifically the undersides, scratched into the timber, sometimes so faint you'd miss them unless the light struck just right, are strange marks. Circles overlapping like petals, stars with extra lines, inverted letters, shapes that don't appear in any church doctrine. These are not careless carvings. They are protective symbols, folk marks, apotropaic signs, charms made not with prayer but with blade and belief. In early modern Bavaria, religion and superstition were not opposites. They lived together, often in the same house, sometimes even in the same sentence. A farmer might pray to Saint Walpurga in the morning, then hammer iron nails into his barn's threshold by afternoon. A mother might cross herself while drawing water, then mutter an old rhyme under her breath as her child sipped the first spoonful. And inside churches, the holiest of spaces, symbols outside Scripture, were often quietly welcomed. These marks were meant to protect the structure, the people, even the land beneath it. No one spoke of them aloud, but everyone knew they were there. One common shape was the gazy wheel, a 6 or 8-petaled circle often found near doorways or chimneys. Its purpose was to trap evil, confuse it, spin it, hold it fast in the loops. Another was the VV mark, short for Virgo Virginum, the Virgin of Virgins, believed to invoke Mary's protection. And then there were burn marks, intentionally made with candle flames, not by accident, but by design. These were meant to ward off fire, strangely enough. The idea was simple. If the building already bore the mark of flame, perhaps fire would be tricked into sparing it. Most of these carvings were done quietly, often by the builders themselves. Stonemasons would chisel them beneath altars. Carpenters would etch them into beams before raising the frame. Even church patrons, those who donated money for construction, might request a particular mark near their family's pew, a kind of spiritual insurance policy. What's striking is how little distinction people made between divine protection and protective superstition. To the villagers of 17th century Bavaria, there was no contradiction in believing that God and geometry could work together. That prayer could be said at night, in chalk marks drawn by morning. And it wasn't just in churches. These symbols bled into everyday spaces, on the lintels of farmhouses, on hearthstones, inside barns and stables, a curved M to shield the family, a small X near the door to confuse witches, and always circles, endless, turning, safe. Historians have since found these carvings in surprising places, in libraries, in mills, even on ancient door frames, later hidden behind plaster and paint. One discovery in a Bamberg bakery revealed over a dozen symbols carved into the flour chute, perhaps to bless the bread or ward off bad grain. For the people of the time, the world was full of threats, plague, crop failure, sudden death, and spiritual danger. They could not see most of these things, but they could mark their presence. That was enough. Even the church didn't fully forbid such symbols. As long as they were quiet, non-heretical, and didn't compete with Scripture, most clergy looked the other way. After all, what harm could come from a carved circle or a bit of soot? And for many priests who lived among the same fears, these marks felt like an extension of faith, not a contradiction. But there was a catch. If fear shifted, if paranoia took root, these same protective marks could be used against you. A symbol etched to shield your home could be interpreted as a sign of secret knowledge. A charm above your child's cradle could be seen as a token of witchcraft. This duality of safety becoming suspicion was part of everyday life. People had to walk a careful line. Too few protections, and your neighbors thought you naive. Too many, and they wondered what you were afraid of, or worse, what you were hiding. Imagine being a craftsman in that time. A mason shaping stone beneath a church window. You scratch a small sun into the corner. Not because anyone told you to, but because your grandfather did the same. You don't call it a charm. You just do it. But 10 years later, That mark could be pointed at by someone during a trial, and they might ask, why was it placed there? What were you keeping out or letting in? The very tools people used to protect themselves could become evidence of guilt. It was a quiet, terrifying contradiction. And yet the practice endured. Long after the trials ended, long after the flames went cold and the prison keys were rusted, people still carved the marks. In corners, behind doors, beneath beds, as if to say the world had changed, but not enough to take chances. Today, if you visit a small Bavarian church, one that hasn't been renovated too recently, you might still spot them. Look along the pews. Trace your hand under the rafters. In one chapel outside Bamberg, there's a mark beneath the baptismal font, an old spiral, faded but firm. No one talks about it anymore. It's just there like a shadow under the light. But maybe that's the point. These marks were never meant to be spoken of loudly. They were whispers in wood, prayers without words. And like many things from that fearful time, they remind us that protection and danger often came from the same place. You needed to be seen as good, but not too good. Wise, but not too wise. And always, you needed to hope that whatever you scratched into the timber would be enough. Churches in 17th century Bavaria were more than places of worship. They were community anchors, standing at the center of village life, visible from nearly every field and path. Their bells rang out over births, deaths, market days, and storms. Inside their walls, people were baptized, married, and mourned. But beyond the liturgy, beyond the Latin chants and golden chalices, these churches also carried another layer, a secret one, etched into the grain of the wood and the roughness of the stone. If you stood in the nave and tilted your head back to look at the exposed rafters, you might find carved suns, spirals, or crude stars, all worked in by hand when the timber was first raised. Not decorative at all. These were popular devices, ritual marks meant to ward off demons, witches, and misfortune. And what's fascinating is that many of the men who carved them were not priests nor scholars, but local craftsmen. Carpenters, stonecutters, apprentices with calloused fingers and little Latin. They worked not from theology, but from tradition. Their fathers and grandfathers had done the same. The signs were handed down by demonstration, not doctrine. A circle scratched with a nail, a pair of crossing lines tucked into a joint, a knot of 8 points drawn with a bit of charcoal before a beam was fixed into place. It was as much a part of building as mortar and mallet. There was no instruction manual. These weren't the kinds of symbols you found in church texts or cathedral blueprints. They lived at the margins, in the silence between formal religion and folk belief, and yet the church never fully rejected them. Why would it? For the average villager, these symbols didn't contradict the church, they coexisted with it. A prayer to St. Michael might be followed by a handful of salt sprinkled on the doorstep. A hymn might be sung in the morning, and a protective knot tied beneath a child's pillow that night. This blurred boundary between orthodoxy and superstition created a delicate balance. In quiet times, it worked. The symbols were overlooked, even respected. But when fear took root, when plague came or crops failed or rumors of witches stirred, that balance shifted dangerously. Suddenly, the same signs that once offered reassurance began to raise questions. Why did that beam have a circle carved into it? Why was that stone above the vestry marked with a pentagram, even a Christianized one? Was the builder protecting the church or hiding something within it? And if someone carved that symbol, what else might they believe? In some towns, this growing unease led to strange behavior. People began scraping off old markings or chipping away at old thresholds, trying to erase signs that had once brought them comfort. Others doubled down, adding more symbols, more carvings, more little bags of ash and rosemary tucked into corners. One village just south of Bamberg had a curious tradition recorded in a mid-century journal. Every spring, before Palm Sunday, the church warden would anoint the doorposts not just with holy water, but with garlic and vinegar. No one knew exactly why. It wasn't in any church book. But the practice was seen as sacred. To skip It would have been, in some villagers' minds, as dangerous as skipping mass. And this wasn't isolated to rural folk. Even the wealthy occasionally hedged their bets. Some noble estates built private chapels with unusually dense symbol work hidden behind panels or beneath floorboards. There's evidence that in at least one case, the master mason who designed the bishop's summer chapel had quietly added marks used in older pagan traditions, protective spirals, triple moons, and planetary signs. Whether this was an act of quiet rebellion or simply old habits creeping in, no one can say. Of course, this layering of belief wasn't unique to Bavaria. But here, the climate of the times made everything feel more precarious. With witch trials looming and inquisitions sniffing for heresy, even well-meaning symbols could backfire. It is chilling to imagine being the person who carved such a mark. Years later, someone might spot it and ask who put it there. Who would remember? And worse, who might claim to remember differently? There was one case in the records of Bamberg where a young stonemason, barely 20, was accused of embedding dark marks in the altar steps of a chapter store. He insisted they were purely decorative. Swirls, flowers, just patterning. But a local priest testified that one of the shapes resembled an ancient sunwheel, possibly pre-Christian. The boy was detained, interrogated, and eventually released, likely due to his age and social status, but his career was over. He never worked again in Bamberg. Sometimes the fear attached not just to the symbols, but to the materials. Oak was favored over ash. Ash, despite being plentiful, was rumored to draw lightning. Some masons refused to use stones quarried on certain hills, claiming the soil beneath them held unblessed memory. It was a time when even raw materials carried spiritual baggage. In this fragile climate, the church itself became both a sanctuary and a site of suspicion. It welcomed those who feared evil, and yet could be the very place where someone first cast doubt, a murmured comment in the nave. A glance at the carved mark near the choir loft. A priest clearing his throat as he glanced toward the beams. To modern eyes, all of this might seem fanciful. But if you lived then, with famine a constant threat and justice shaped by whispers, it made perfect sense. You wanted protection from all sides, heavenly and earthly. You trusted the Virgin Mary to guide your soul. But you also scratched circles into your doorframe because your grandmother said it kept foxes and witches away. This blending, this overlap, is what gives Bavarian churches their quiet strangeness. They're not just monuments to faith. They're palimpsests, layered documents of belief, fear, hope, and memory. And so, in the cool shade of these stone chapels, beneath the vaulted ceilings and flickering candlelight, the old marks remain. Some are barely visible now, softened by time and dust. Others have been uncovered during renovations, sparking small flurries of academic interest. But in the villages themselves, few people speak of them. They're not denied, just ignored. Like an old rumor everyone knows, but no one wants to stir. You can still visit these places. Step inside one of those centuries-old churches, sit in the back pew, and feel the hush of old stone and stained glass. If the light is right, you might see a tiny carving on the wooden support beside you. A shape you don't quite recognize. A mark whose meaning is half lost. And in that moment, you may realize something the villagers of Bamberg always knew, that faith and fear often lived in the same room, and sometimes carved their names on the same beam. Chapter 4. A Chancellor's Quiet Dinner with a Secret Accusation segment. 1. The downfall of Bamberg's Chancellor Georg Hahn begins with a single whispered name. In the spring of 1628, as the first buds pushed through the frost-hardened soil in Bamberg, a quiet dinner was being prepared in the home of Chancellor Georg Hahn. The house stood on a respectable street near the center of town, a few steps from the town hall and within earshot of the cathedral bells. It had arrived by hand, unusual for a man of his position. He opened it cautiously, scanning the neat but hurried script. He made small talk with his children, asked about their studies, and commented on the improved weather. But inside, a pit had begun to open in his stomach. Documents moved a little too quickly off desks when he passed. Maybe he had simply spoken the wrong sentence in the wrong setting. Or perhaps, in a moment of compassion, He had questioned the treatment of one of the accused. It didn't matter. Because once the wheels of suspicion began to turn, they rarely stopped. The sense that people were watching him, not with suspicion, but with distance. The kind of distance one puts between themselves and an open flame. He knew, better than most, what happened to those whose names were whispered in the wrong company. The message was simple. He'd overseen trials himself. He knew the procedures, the legal loopholes. He appealed to the bishop. He submitted legal challenges, but he was quickly warned to stop. Persisting could be seen as obstruction. Obstruction could be reclassified as sympathy. And sympathy for witches was very near to being one yourself. He returned home to find a single piece of parchment left by a court messenger. Instead, he folded the paper and placed it in his desk. Rumors spread that he had begged on his knees before the bishop. Others claimed he had cursed the town under his breath. It didn't matter whether these things were true. They sounded true. And truth, in Bamberg, had lost its footing. He spent the rest of that day in silence, sitting by the window. That evening he did not eat. The charges? He had questioned the court. He had attempted to obstruct divine justice. He had likely learned witchcraft from his wife. His children watched from the stairs as soldiers led their father away. One son tried to follow. He was held back. Georg was taken not to the Druden house, but to a more discreet holding cell. Officials said this was due to his rank. In truth, they were avoiding a public spectacle, confirming that the sentence had been carried out. If anyone could navigate this madness, it would be him. When Katharina was moved to the Druden house, Georg wrote a letter to the emperor himself. In it, he described the conditions of the prison, the illegality of the charges, and the rapid decay of justice in the region. Georg Hahn learned the final lesson of Bamberg. That power protected no one, not truly. Once your name was spoken in the wrong room, no amount of reason could call it back. He urged intervention. A friend within the court warned him that his name had been mentioned in an inquiry. Nothing formal, nothing official. She had once been seen walking barefoot in the garden at dusk. A midwife had questioned the ease with which her last child had been born. None of it would hold up in a fair court. But in Bamberg, in 1628, fair courts were a memory. But mentioned, when the guards were ordered to stop feeding her, she confessed. She named others. It's unclear whether she believed what she said, or whether she was simply trying to end her pain. From the outside, it looked like any upper-class home of the era. Solid oak shutters, red roof tiles, and a well-maintained stoop. But inside that evening, the walls would soon begin to close in. Georg Hahn was not a man given to superstition. But he did notice that several names he knew people he had dined with, worked beside, had been called in for questioning recently. Some had not returned. A trained lawyer and respected city official, he believed in order, reason, and the written word. He had served the bishop's court for years, overseeing matters of land, taxation, and civic justice. His household was well kept, his staff loyal, and his wife, Katharina, known for her piety and good sense. Their children were bright, well-fed, and educated. In many ways, the Huns were exactly what a good Catholic family in 17th century Bamberg ought to be, which is why what happened to them struck such a chilling chord. That evening in April, as candles were lit and bread broken at their long wooden table, Georg received a letter. Mentioned. That word was enough to freeze the blood. Georg said nothing to his family during the meal. The next morning, he went to his office early. He searched the court registers and inquired with clerks. Nothing appeared on record. No official charges. He also noticed something else. The sudden coldness in the air around his colleagues. Conversations that stopped when he entered the room. Georg Hahn had made a quiet enemy. Perhaps not even a personal one. Still, he believed that his position would protect him. He was a chancellor, after all. He had friends in high places. But fear doesn't care about reason. Within 2 weeks, Katharina Hahn, his wife, was arrested. The charges were vague. She had allegedly made strange comments to a servant. Georg protested. Still, he could not remain silent. What he didn't know was that his letter would arrive too late. Katharina was tortured over several days. She was denied contact with her children. On May 17th, 1628, she was burned at the stake. The execution took place in the early morning. It was quiet, efficient. Georg was not informed until it was already done. Georg did not weep, at least not then. Over the next weeks, he became a ghost in his own home. His children spoke less. His colleagues stopped visiting, and the final blow came. In early July, Georg himself was arrested, and he had written letters to the emperor without permission. He was taken in the night. No trial date was set. There was no chance to appeal. His former friends did not come to his defense. For all his learning, all his titles, and all it had started with was a single letter, received during a quiet dinner. By the time Georg Khan was officially recorded as a prisoner, no one in Bamberg was surprised. That in itself was the warning sign. Not one gasp of disbelief, not a single merchant at market saying, "Surely not him." It was as though the town had quietly agreed to rearrange its memory. The same man who had signed birth certificates, overseen land disputes, and settled arguments between neighbors was now simply the accused. And when someone is labeled, the town stops asking questions. At home, the Han household fell under its own kind of confinement. Georg's eldest daughter, Maria, just 15, became head of the house in everything but name. One simply read, "Do not speak aloud. They are listening." She woke the servants, managed the food stores, oversaw her younger siblings' lessons, and walked the hallways at night listening for sounds that didn't belong. If pain produced silence, it was deemed stubbornness, a different kind of guilt. So they changed their approach. One clerk remembered Georg lending a book to a professor who was later accused. A shopkeeper recalled him walking home with a man who had since vanished. A former maid remembered that Katharina Hahn had once carried a pouch of rosemary, tied with a red string clearly, a charm. The house moved forward in the way that a sled might continue sliding even after its rider has fallen off. But the weight of absence was everywhere. The hollow clink of silverware, the sound of someone saying, "Father," and then stopping mid-sentence. The girl, trembling, replied no. Over and over. In it, he spoke openly about the corruption in Bamberg, the illegal confiscation of property, and the sickness spreading through the court, until one of the inquisitors placed a sealed envelope on the table before her. The candle that always stayed lit in the front hall, just in case. She just pressed the paper into the hearth with a piece of iron and didn't blink as it curled into black. They hadn't locked the doors before, not like this. Another to a convent. Maria disappeared from the records entirely. No marriage certificate, no land titles, no burial registry. Historians assume she changed her name or left the region altogether. Not by trial, not by judge, but by administrative consensus. And the suspicion grew out of nothing more than the town's need for a new target. The shutters wouldn't stay open, and the bell by the front door sometimes rang without wind or visitor. Most dismissed this as nonsense. Others left a pinch of salt on the gatepost when they passed. His body was not displayed. His ashes were not returned. His official file is preserved in the Bamberg archives. 57 pages of accusations, interrogations, and final notations. Neat handwriting. Margins perfectly aligned. The next morning, she burned every remaining paper that bore her father's name. Not out of hatred, but love. To protect what little was left of him from becoming someone else's evidence. His name did not appear in church the following Sunday. According to one servant, he simply repeated the same phrase each time he was asked about sorcery. "I know no magic, only law." His name was even removed from one of the city ledgers, a quiet administrative exorcism. When her younger brother asked what had happened, she only replied that the stars had looked especially far away. Now every window was bolted shut before sunset. The cat was kept inside. The front gate creaked a little more often than it should have. Letters arrived, but most were unsigned. Some slipped beneath the door, written in rushed Latin or near illegible Bavarian script. Maria burned that one. She didn't cry. Somehow, meals still happened. Beds were still made. In the town itself, the name Han was spoken less and less. Some claimed not to know him. Others said they had warned him. And yet, behind closed doors, some whispered that he had not broken. That under pressure, even under the rack, Georg Khan refused to confess. Eventually, the authorities grew frustrated. Torture was only useful when it led to confession. They brought in witnesses, not of crimes, but of association. And then came the most devastating moment. His own daughter, Maria, was summoned. She was asked simple questions. Did your father ever speak of dreams? Did he keep a journal? Did your mother ever draw symbols in the dust? It contained a letter written in her father's hand meant for the emperor, never sent. Maria read it once. Her face didn't change. She only asked if she could keep the letter. They said no. She returned home that night without speaking. Within a week, Georg Khan was sentenced. Instead, his family received a single slip of paper. Justice has been administered. May God protect the innocent. No date, no seal, no signature. Maria wept that night for the first time, not loudly, just quietly, with her head bowed beside the hearth. The Han children were split among distant relatives. One went to Wurzburg. The Han house stood empty for a decade before being sold. Locals said it was cold, even in summer. As for the records of Georg Khan, they remain. And nowhere in those pages is there any mention of who exactly first spoke his name. Perhaps it was a rival. Perhaps it was a slip. Perhaps it was no one at all. What we do know is this. In Bamberg, silence was not safety. It was only the space between names. And once yours was spoken, the quiet became deafening. Chapter 5. The Witch Prisons Beneath the Rathaus, Segment 1. Life. Inside the claustrophobic cells under Bamberg's town hall, the Rathaus in Bamberg is an architectural marvel. A Gothic and Baroque confection that seems to hover on a stone. Bridge over the Regnitz River, painted with vivid frescoes and adorned with statues. It remains one of the most photographed buildings in Germany. Tourists marvel at its beauty. They don't often realize what lies beneath. Under that painted facade, below the cobbled bridge and the whispering halls, were once dark, narrow cells. Prisoners did not walk in through the grand doors above. They were designed for isolation, for making people disappear. Thick walls muffled cries. Narrow slits provided minimal air. Some had no light source at all. Straw was tossed in once a week, often wet. Buckets for waste were emptied irregularly. Prisoners slept curled in corners, the cold of the stone leaching warmth from their bones. Often, days or weeks would pass with no contact at all. There, the questioning began, not with conversation, but with positioning. The body was placed on the bench, or the rack, or bound by the wrists and lifted until the shoulders strained. The anticipation became its own kind of torment. Then, suddenly the guards would arrive, without warning. Without explanation, the word is jarring in its gentleness. An interview conjures images of sitting across a table, exchanging ideas. In Bamberg, it meant something else. One technique involved pouring cold water down the back of the neck while forcing the accused to kneel on sharpened stones. It sounds less violent than the rack, but often broke a person faster. They were brought in through side alleys and stairwells, blindfolded, often at night. Their feet touched cool, uneven stone, their shoulders scraped damp walls. They reminded the accused of God's mercy, then asked again for names. Sometimes the accused begged for absolution without admitting guilt. These were the most dangerous moments. A refusal to confess was seen as proof of a pact with the devil. And so, ironically, the only way to die as a Christian was to admit to something you hadn't done. Did you consort with the devil? And always, who else? Name them. Tell us their signs, their gatherings, their words. When she finally broke, her only words were, "I dreamt of rain." That was enough. Dreams were often cited as spiritual evidence. Hers became a confession. A few were kind in small ways. He spent 32 days chained in a standing position. On the 33rd, he collapsed. But beneath those stone floors, a slow erosion of trust and humanity played out in shadows. His legs had gone numb, and his skin had begun to peel where the iron bit into it. People knew it was there, but they didn't speak of it. Children were warned not to ask questions. Some townspeople crossed themselves when walking past the side entrance. Others simply changed their route. He was finally brought to the questioning chamber and gave 17 names. 12 of those named were arrested within the week. One man, known only by his initials in the records, reportedly left scraps of bread outside certain cells, extra straw when no one was looking. But beneath your feet, where cold water once seeped through stone and whispered secrets were broken into screams, there are still scars in the walls. But others embrace their role. Power, even in its smallest form, can corrupt quickly. Too small for standing fully upright, too short to lie flat. The ceilings dripped in rainy seasons and sweated in summer. Some were detained for clarification. Others were held because of rumors. And once inside, the burden of proof shifted. The prisoner had to prove innocence, not the court guilt. In a system without defense counsel, that meant saying whatever they thought might save them. Chains were fixed to the floor, not to prevent escape. No one was going anywhere, but to break the will. A person shackled to the same spot for days, weeks, months could be convinced of nearly anything, and then they were swallowed by the earth, a cough echoing from the cell beside you. The sound of boots on the stairs followed by nothing at all. These cells were not designed for comfort, nor even for containment in the modern sense. Each cell was small, but the silence was what most couldn't bear. Not total silence, but the wrong kind. The kind filled with faint moans, scratching, and the weight. Always the weight. Once inside, the prisoners had no knowledge of time. No clocks, no bells. Some tried to count the meals. Others marked scratches in the walls, only to lose track when the guards scraped them clean. A few spoke aloud to themselves, whispering prayers or poems, until they could no longer remember the words. Torture did not happen immediately. Prisoners were taken to a second chamber deeper within the complex, longer, darker, colder. In the court records, these sessions were recorded as interviews. Each session had a purpose: obtain confession. If confession was not forthcoming, pressure increased, thumbs crushed, ligaments torn. The accused were asked the same questions, over and over. Have you attended the Sabbath? Did you ride through the air? Some prisoners resisted. They stayed silent. Others confessed immediately, hoping to bargain for leniency. But leniency was a mirage. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these prisons was how many people entered without any formal charge. Guards were not always cruel, at least not actively. Most simply did their duty, fed the prisoners, cleaned the cells, prepared the tools. Priests visited occasionally, offering confession. But their role was more to prepare the condemned for execution than to advocate. There was a story of a woman named Margarita, imprisoned for 16 weeks before ever seeing a tribunal. She refused to speak for the first 10. And then there was Elias Rem, a local miller. No one knows what happened to the other 5. The prison beneath the Wrath House became a kind of myth in its own time. And above it all, the town went on. Markets bustled. Sermons were preached. Bread was baked. Today, if you visit Bamberg, you can walk across the same bridge, admire the same paintings, hear the same bells. They've been cleaned, renovated, made safe for tourism. But some remain, not for history. But as a quiet reminder that even the most beautiful places can hide the darkest rooms. The routine of suffering beneath the Wrath House rarely ended with a first interrogation. Once a confession was beaten into shape, the guards prepared what they called the long ledger, a thick folio kept behind a locked cabinet. In truth, it only opened a second chapter. A confession did not guarantee execution. It guaranteed processing. The wheels of the court turned slowly and cruelly. Scholars who have studied them describe a disturbing rhythm in the text. She had been arrested after her grandmother, herself already imprisoned, claimed Anna had danced with her in the forest during a Sabbath. Recovered with salts. We'll proceed. No other detail. No mention of the girl's age. No indication of whether she lived past her testimony. The girl resisted for 5 sessions. On the 6th, she broke. They weren't written in journals, but scratched into the wooden walls with nails, bits of broken pottery, even fingers. Short phrases, initials, tally marks. One cell bore the repeated word, Wareham, why over a dozen times. No one knows. Prisoners lived in them, slept in them, and often died in them. Nothing about the prisoner is mentioned. Just the equipment. Some were bolted to the wall with short chains that only allowed a foot or two of movement. The idea, according to court strategy, was to avoid contamination of testimony. In practice, it broke the accused in new and deeper ways. One mother, Marguerite Klein, was told during interrogation that her daughter had confessed. She resisted until they brought her a letter, supposedly written by the girl. It wasn't her daughter's handwriting. Marguerite confessed anyway. Others were fixed directly to the floor. Guards applied a strange ritual to the process, testing the chains each morning, noting their condition. Not just money or livestock, but pots, linens, clothing. The town profited from the dead. Visitors say they feel watched. Tour guides speak softly, as if afraid to raise their voices. And those who stand too long in the doorway often step back without knowing why. These seizures were recorded meticulously, even as the stories behind them faded. In the prison's ledgers, you can find entries like 1 woolen blanket, stained, 2 cracked pewter cups, a child wooden toy, unclaimed. If a shackle was rusted or worn, it was replaced, not out of concern for the prisoner, but to preserve the efficiency of interrogation. They were removed through side passages and taken to the execution ground outside the town walls. Some were marched through alleys at dawn, faces covered. As trials dwindled and imperial oversight increased, the court no longer had need of hidden cells. Over time, the chambers were repurposed, some for storage, some sealed entirely. Later generations avoided the subject. The chambers became a rumor, a ghost story passed between children, a warning told in whispers. Others were carried out unconscious, their names already forgotten by those above. Another had a calendar of sorts marking out what must have been days, each line crossed through with brutal slashes. Her confession was brief, fragmented, riddled with contradictions. Historians peeled back layers of stone and plaster, revealing iron rings embedded in masonry, scratches where hands had reached for light, and lines scored deep into the walls like private prayers. The Rathaus above remained unchanged, still elegant, still admired. She claimed she had flown, though she didn't know how. She said she had seen the devil, but described him as her neighbor in a black coat. She gave 3 names. All 3 were arrested within the week. Certain phrases appear again and again. Consorted with the evil one, rode upon the storm, did cast charms to spoil the cow. These were not the accused words. A priest named Father Matthias, who visited the cells as a confessor, kept a quiet set of notes never intended for the court. In one entry, he wrote, "Spoke with a woman accused of drying herbs too late in the season. She wept only once, when I asked if she had children. Sad, yes. 5, but her voice cracked only on the youngest name." They were the expectations of the interrogators, shaped and repeated until the prisoner, in desperation or confusion, said what needed to be said. Once a prisoner confessed, new interrogations followed to verify the story. Names given under duress were tracked down, questioned, and often tortured in turn. Each confession became the seed of several more. Every statement was copied neatly in ink by court scribes. Each page bore the same headings: name, origin, confession, names of accomplices. At the end, the accused was ordered to sign. Most could not write their own name, so they marked an X or scratched a trembling cross with a quill they could barely hold. Some believed that this signature marked the end of their ordeal. The archive in Bamberg still holds these ledgers, hundreds of pages, written looping, spidery Gothic script. One section of the ledger includes the testimony of a girl named Anna, just 13 years old. In the margins of Anna's record, a note from the scribe reads simply, "Subject fainted." Some prisoners left behind fragments that would later be called prison diaries, though few would recognize them as such. The most haunting inscription was found behind a loose brick, "Ich bin nicht allein." I am not alone. Was it a cry of comfort or a warning? The shackles used in these cells were rarely removed. One surviving record details the inventory of a single chamber: 3 pairs of ankle irons, 2 hand clamps, 1 waist chain, 2 thumb screws, a wooden table with leather straps, and a brazier for heating tools. There were moments, however, when the human voice broke through. Father Matthias wrote that he gave her a blessing, though the next page notes her execution was scheduled within days. Sometimes entire families were confined at once. Parents in one cell, children in another, each unaware of the other's fate. After execution, the belongings of the condemned were seized. In the end, most of those imprisoned beneath the Rathaus never saw the sky again. The prison itself was never shut down formally. It simply stopped being used. Only in the 20th century did serious efforts begin to document what had happened. But below, where shadows once ruled, the truth had waited patiently. And though the rooms are empty now, the air remains strangely heavy. Because in those depths where names became numbers and words became weapons, the silence still remembers. Chapter 6. The Firewood Trade and an Unholy Task, Segment 1. The Hidden Economy of Executing Witches Woodcutters. Guards and ash collectors from the outside, it seemed simple. A trial was held, a sentence declared, and a fire lit beneath the condemned. The town gathered, the priests prayed, and the smoke curled into the sky like a dark ribbon. But beneath that grim ceremony was a surprisingly well-oiled system, an economy with its own jobs. Payments, logistics, and quiet arrangements. Bamberg did not burn witches impulsively. It burned them with method. So, a contract existed, often informal, occasionally scrawled on parchment between the city and select woodsmen. Their job was to provide seasoned oak, birch, or pine. Pine was best avoided. It burned too quickly and unevenly. They drove wooden stakes into the ground and packed straw tightly around the base. Nails were often used to affix iron rings to the posts, so the condemned could be restrained upright. Their real task, though, was to prevent escape, or worse, disruption from the families of the condemned. If someone shouted too loudly, wept too fiercely, or made accusations in the wrong direction, they were removed. Occasionally, someone who cried too much at an execution was later investigated themselves. He lived outside the town walls, often in a cottage provided by the city. He was feared but not reviled, unless he became too familiar. He was paid per job, and each job came with a price list. Grief, after all, could be a sign of hidden guilt. Quietly, with no announcement, it was not an act of mercy. It was efficiency. A quick unconsciousness made for a cleaner fire, less struggling, and a quieter crowd. Usually 2 or 3 men, armed with shovels and thick gloves. They were instructed not to speak during the task. They swept up bones, half-melted iron, and the odd fragment of cloth. All of it was carried to a pit outside the city limits. Some ashes were buried, others were scattered. In rare cases, they were mixed into mortar and used in construction, a fact whispered by masons, but never admitted aloud. Oak was ideal, dense, long-burning, and consistent. The town square would be mostly empty, save for birds and a few yawning market vendors. The workers moved quickly. No one wanted to be seen preparing a pyre too slowly. He was there to pray, to speak of repentance, to assure the crowd that justice and salvation walked hand in hand. When someone was accused, their goods were seized. Lands, tools, clothing, even their homes liquidated quietly and efficiently. The proceeds went to cover court costs, prison upkeep, and, of course, the price of execution. But in Bamberg, they were also logistical enterprises. Files were kept, payments tallied, services rendered. There are letters between town officials discussing the rising price of straw. One meeting even debated whether reusing iron shackles from previous executions was appropriate or unhygienic. If the value exceeded the cost, the remainder went to the treasury. Yet he also had to signal subtly when the executioner should begin. A nod, a pause in prayer, a folded hand, all quiet signals built over time. Some priests grew hollow under this burden. Others drank too heavily afterward. A few came to believe that they were instruments of God in the purest sense and began writing sermons that blurred the line between fire and faith. Executions were expensive. That so many people, woodcutters, blacksmiths, notaries, guards, participated not with passion, but with indifference. Each step was just a job, each flame a scheduled event. They required planning, material, and manpower. The wood had to be cut, dried, and transported. Others accepted it without comment. A few even prospered. One man, Hans Loader, earned enough supplying timber during the peak of the trials to purchase his own cart and hire assistants. Later, he tried to shift into firewood for weddings and town festivals, but found few takers. His name had become too closely linked to smoke and shrieking. Iron restraints needed cleaning and repair. The site had to be cleared beforehand and swept after. There were guards, clerks, priests, fire watchers, and often overlooked, the people who handled what was left behind. It began with the wood. Not just any bundle would do. Wet logs smoked too much, delaying the process. Damp ash could be seen as an ill omen. Woodcutters would stack the timber behind the wrath house in advance. Invoices recorded cords of wood assigned to each execution. Sometimes you'd find entries like for 2 women, 5 bundles, or for Dr. Fessler, 7 cords burned slow. The notes weren't cruel. They were matter of fact, the language of a business. Some woodsmen refused the work, fearing spiritual consequence. Then came the laborers. These were men assigned to prepare the execution site. They dug shallow trenches to hold embers. This stage was done early in the morning, and there were guards, usually 4, sometimes 6, posted to keep the crowds in order. The priest's role was public but complex. The executioner, of course, was at the center of it all. In Bamberg, the job of executioner, called the narrator, avoided and necessary. To light the pyre, 1 silver thaler. To tighten the bindings, an extra groat. To strike the final blow, if needed, either with a club or blade before the fire reached the face, 2 thalers. Yes, sometimes a blow is delivered. But perhaps the strangest role in this entire economy belonged to the ash collectors. After the flames died, someone had to clear the remains. There was no ceremony, no grave marker, just silence. And all of it cost money. Paid most often not by the city, but by confiscation. In this way, each trial fueled the next. It's tempting to think of witch trials as emotional eruptions, sudden bursts of superstition. It wasn't only about fear. It was about process. There's a kind of quiet horror in this. That so much death unfolded not in chaos, but in order. And while the condemned screamed, prayed, or fell silent, the town moved on. Bells rang. Bread was baked. Horseshoes were hammered in forges. Children played in alleyways, only glancing toward the square when the wind changed and the smoke curled low. Because by then, everyone knew what it meant. The fire was part of life, and behind it all, someone quietly signed a receipt. On paper, it all appeared neat. The execution ledger was maintained with a precision that bordered on reverence. Expenses were listed in columns: wood, nails, iron shackles, cart rental, labor hours, priest stipend. There was even an occasional line for refreshments provided to city officials attending the trial. The blacksmith who was told to fashion 5 new chains without asking questions. The cart driver who picked up prisoners at dawn and dropped them near the stake before breakfast. The women who cleaned the executioner's clothes, blackened with soot and stinking of lye. All of this tucked into tidy folders, tied with twine, and shelved beside the more routine business of the city grain taxes, marriage licenses, contracts for bridge repairs. But they touched the edge of the fire, and they knew it. Other times, it was fear. Refusing to take part in the apparatus of execution, refusing to deliver wood or clean tools could be interpreted as sympathy for the condemned. A handful of school records from the early 1630s list student absences on execution days. Not all were excused. Some children, it seems, were required to attend, especially those from families with civic roles. Their homes were small, poorly maintained, and frequently passed over in town records. They were not part of the city guilds. Their profession granted no status. It was seen as a lesson in obedience, morality, and the price of defiance. When one ash collector tried to join a local prayer group, the organizer declined, saying it might make the other women uneasy. And in Bamberg, sympathy was a short walk from suspicion. He was punished with an afternoon of silence and copywork. Forced to write, truth defends the righteous over and over on a slate. Blacksmiths earned extra coin-making shackles. Bakers supplied the morning bread for guards. Local farmers were paid in hay or dried fruit for transporting straw. And when it was all done, the town paid for silence. The burned posts were removed and replaced with a low fence. A single plaque was erected years later, too late for anyone to visit with real memory. It read, "They asked for clean wood. I brought it. They asked again. I brought more. And then one day they stopped asking." In Bamberg, death by fire had become part of the municipal routine. He was a wheelwright by trade, occasionally hired to reinforce the town carts used to transport firewood and supplies. They were people with jobs, with children, with fears of their own. And in their silence, their shrug, their next delivery, they helped keep the fire burning. But they carried the remnants of death, physically, sometimes literally, and that made them ghosts in the eyes of the town. A rhythm built not on hatred or fanaticism, but on task, on routine, on invoice and reply. In the margins of the payment logs, names are shortened to initials. A 1627 sermon likened the labor of clearing the pyres to tending the wounds of Christ. The ash was a reminder of sin burned away, the fire, a purifier of souls. But even priests flinched at the lingering smell, and few visited the clearing outside the walls unless required to. Invoices are sometimes anonymous. It's likely these workers asked for this discretion, hoping their neighbors wouldn't recognize them in the official accounts. In his note addressed to the city chamberlain, he requested that his name not be written on future execution delivery slips, explaining, "My children are refused in a schoolyard. The teacher says I helped make the fire." What the records do not show, at least not directly, is the strain it placed on the people who supported the machine, not the judges or priests, but the ones who handled the weight of it. These people lived in a strange in-between. They were not the condemned nor the powerful. One of the most unusual records from the era is a short complaint, handwritten in a faded local dialect, from a man named Jakob, no surname given. No reply was recorded. But in the following year's documents, the carts are simply marked as delivered by municipal service. Jacob's name disappears. There are signs of this quiet shame all over the execution economy. And yet, the economy persisted. There were always workers willing to step in when others stepped away. Sometimes it was poverty that drove them. Even the town's children felt the weight of this cycle. One teacher's journal, preserved in the diocesan archives, recounts how a student fainted during a particularly long execution. The ash collectors, perhaps the most overlooked players in this system, lived outside the city proper, often near the river where waste and refuse were dumped. Most people avoided them in public. At the market, they were often served last. At church, they sat near the back. These were not menacing figures. They were fathers, sons, old men with tired backs. Once, a child followed one of them home, curious. He was caught and whipped not for disobedience, but for bringing the smoke into the house. The church tried on occasion to frame these tasks as sacred. The economy of executions touched every part of Bamberg's civic life, not directly, not in coin, but in the way people learned to speak of nothing. After the last of the major trials, the town attempted to erase what it could. The clearing was repurposed. A small orchard was planted. The people who had built the fires, swept the ash, written the names, they did not speak. Their grandchildren asked questions. Their children did not. One of the last known woodcutters involved in the trials left behind a fragment of writing tucked into a prayer book. That, perhaps, is the final note in the music of Bamberg's burning years, not the horror of the executions themselves, but the ordinary rhythm that surrounded them. The people who fanned the flames were not always villains. Chapter 7. The Devil's Mark and the Midwife's Touch, Segment 1. Women healers scrutinized for every blemish. Birth or miscarriage in the quiet corners of 17th century Bavaria. The most trusted person in a village wasn't always the priest or the magistrate. More often, it was the woman who knew how to ease pain. The woman who could find the right plant, say the right word, wrap a wound with clean cloth. They weren't university-trained physicians. Those were few and far between and only catered to the wealthy. Instead, these local women knew what herbs reduced fever. They knew when to deliver lambs, how to brew willow bark tea, how to bind a twisted ankle. Their tools were not scalpels and syringes, but linen, bone, smoke, and patience. Or coax a breech baby into the world with steady hands and whispered comfort. The healer, the midwife, the wise woman. For generations, these women had operated as essential figures in their communities. Some had ones that stopped it. Knowledge of miscarriage-inducing plants was common among women who had little legal control over their bodies or families. But that knowledge, once helpful, could become damning if the wrong person fell ill. And in a time before antiseptic, before vaccines, before germ theory, their knowledge often meant the difference between life and death. And then someone remembered that the midwife had visited, that she'd touched something, that she'd spoken under her breath. But in the age of witch trials, this very knowledge became dangerous. A mole, a scar, a birthmark. Her body, once seen as a source of life, became a map for sin. If they found a mark, it was evidence. Who claimed he saw her placing herbs beneath a doorstep? Why she knew which plants made a woman bleed? She had no defense. Knowledge, once prized, was now evidence. Her independence was proof. Her solitude, guilt. If they didn't, they looked harder. Bruises from childbirth were considered suspicious. Skin darkened from sun or soot suspicious. One had taught her the use of comfrey. Another had shared prayers for safe delivery. The third, her apprentice, had once asked whether a child could be revived with herbs alone. Even a flea bite could be read as proof of a hidden pact. Something strange in shape or color. It was believed to be where the devil had touched his servants. Where they suckled familiars, the church emphasized that every child must be baptized immediately, lest their soul be lost. So midwives were granted temporary spiritual authority to perform emergency baptisms. It was practical, but it blurred the line between laywoman and clergy. And that line, once blurred, drew suspicion. Or where no pain could be felt, could be shackled and dragged through the streets as symbols of evil. Some women, knowing the danger, burned their herbal stores. Others fled the towns entirely, choosing isolation over scrutiny. Over a dozen villages in Franconia recorded an increase in infant mortality. But this was not seen as failure, it was seen as purification. Some carried prayer beads openly. Others invited priests to stand in the room during births. Herbal remedies were hidden or renamed. Nothing was magic. Everything was blessed. Everything approved. The search for such a mark was invasive, humiliating, and often violent. Every successful treatment could be viewed as unnatural. A woman carrying knowledge that most men refused to understand, and that many feared too deeply to trust. Every failed one as malicious. You couldn't always explain how their tinctures worked. You couldn't see the mechanism of healing. And in a deeply religious society, anything unseen but effective risked being tied to the devil. She had helped deliver more than 60 children, rarely lost a mother, and never married. When the miller's wife miscarried, it was Walpurga who was called. The woman lived, but the child did not. Within a week, villagers began to murmur. They said Walpurga's hands were too cold, that she had looked pleased when the labor slowed, that she had been seen walking through the forest alone too often. When a midwife lost a child, whispers began almost immediately. Was the cord wrapped, or was it twisted by unseen forces? Was it truly a natural loss, or had she spoken the wrong words, used the wrong oil? A child that survived against the odds might be seen as evidence of a pact. A child that died was seen as proof of poison or curse. The healer stood on a narrow ledge between gratitude and suspicion, and the wind could change overnight. It wasn't just that they were women in positions of power, it was that their power was invisible. That was especially true when it came to midwives. Birth was sacred, messy, and terrifying. Even under the best conditions, it was risky. Women died often. Babies died more. Many midwives had herbs that could ease labor. A single accusation might begin with a bleeding cow, or a child who stopped speaking, or a batch of soup that tasted strange. And then the devil's mark was sought. This mark, as imagined by the witch hunters of the time, was a physical blemish somewhere on the body, usually in hidden places. A woman accused of witchcraft was stripped and examined by a panel, sometimes publicly. And all of this for women who had spent their lives in service to others. The irony was never lost on them, that the same hands that had delivered dozens of babies, dressed wounds, or comforted grieving mothers. One record tells of a woman named Walpurga, a midwife who had served in her village for over 20 years. Walpurga was arrested on the testimony of a single boy, age 11, during interrogation. She denied everything. But when asked why she had never married, why she spent so much time alone, she was tortured for 4 days, during which she named 3 other women. All had practiced some form of healing. None of them survived. Midwives were particularly vulnerable because of the spiritual anxiety around childbirth. If a child died before baptism, who was at fault? If it lived but with a deformity, who had touched it first? If the mother streamed of strange visions during labor, was it pain or possession? And always at the center of the room was the midwife. Steady hands, bloody apron, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Over time, the number of practicing midwives shrank. Many communities found themselves without anyone trained in childbirth. In 1 year alone, the remaining midwives changed their practices, and still, the suspicion lingered. Because in a town ruled by fear, even bringing life into the world could look like a kind of sorcery. After the trials had consumed so many of the region's wise women and midwives, something peculiar began to happen in the towns and villages across Bavaria. Sickness, once treated with poultices and prayers, became something people learned to endure rather than heal. Mothers watched fevers rise in their children with silent dread, fearing the consequences of asking for help from the wrong person. Officially, the names were replaced with Latin phrases like anonymous obstetrix, unnamed midwife, or sometimes just left blank. Their work had once been sacred. Now, it was unmentionable. Fathers trudged to the city apothecary with unfamiliar herbs in hand, hoping the young clerk could identify them without judgment. And in quiet corners, the people who had once been called for everything from childbirth to toothaches faded from memory, not because they were truly forgotten, but because to remember them too clearly was to remember why they had disappeared. That tincture was chamomile, long used by women in the countryside and once listed among the dangerous herbs confiscated during raids on healer homes. Male physicians began to insert themselves into labor rooms, not always because they had more knowledge, but because they had more authority. Some claimed that only men, untainted by Eve's curse, could properly oversee the purity of birth. Not formally accused, but recorded, monitored, watched. The mother survived, but the child died within hours. Liesel herself had helped deliver over 70 children in her career and was beloved by many. Not magic, not a curse. Just a comfort passed down like a lullaby. But one neighbor reported that Liesel had paused during the delivery and whispered something in a language not understood. A woman might say she was making a sleeping tea, but never list its ingredients. Mothers told their daughters to be careful what they said at market, even if they were only buying common roots. Her answer was simple. Words on paper burn faster than leaves in the fire. Others worked as silent assistants to male doctors, standing behind them in rooms they once led, handing over the same tools they had once used with confidence, but now with bowed heads. That was enough. She was arrested the next day and interrogated for nearly a week. Medical textbooks written a century later still dismissed female healers as relics or frauds. Only recently have historians begun to untangle how much wisdom was lost, how much healing was forgotten, simply because the hands that once offered it were shackled and burned. The irony, of course, was that most of these men had never seen a birth before entering the room. The erasure was deliberate. One town even removed the names of executed midwives from baptismal records they had signed in years past. They had to swear oaths, undergo examinations, and submit their tools for inspection. No one talks about them, but they're there. A sprig of yarrow, a twist of red thread, not decoration, not superstition, just memory. A simple birthing spoon or herbal sachet might be confiscated. Some towns even required midwives to report every birth they assisted in within 24 hours and include whether or not the infant had any visible deformities. This rewriting of medical history had consequences. Generations of women stopped passing down knowledge that had been refined over centuries. A bitter tea for menstrual cramps, once a staple in nearly every home, was now hidden behind coded phrases. Physicians with university degrees, many of whom had never delivered a child or treated a farmhand's infected wound, now claimed the territory once managed by village women. They scoffed at herbalism, dismissed folk practices, and encouraged families to avoid superstition. Yet these same men often borrowed remedies once considered witchcraft, repackaging them in Latin and calling them new. A recipe for salve made with bear fat and comfrey for sprained ankles vanished from oral tradition because no one wanted to be caught saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. In the space left behind, formal male-dominated medicine moved in. A record from Bamberg shows that a male doctor in the mid-1630s was praised for using a newly discovered root tincture to treat inflammation. What changed wasn't the remedy. It was the person prescribing it. Even childbirth, once an exclusively female space, was transformed. Midwives, those who remained, were required to register with city councils. And in cases where something went wrong, if the child was born blue, if the mother hemorrhaged, if the cord was wrapped around the neck, the midwife's name was added to a list. One particularly chilling example comes from the village of Altman, where a midwife named Liesel was called to a difficult delivery. She confessed to nothing, and so she died. What no one mentioned at the time was that the words she had whispered were an old birthing prayer in Low Saxon, taught to her by her grandmother, who had learned it from hers. But by then, comfort itself had become suspicious. The slow unraveling of traditional medicine continued for decades. Herbal knowledge became something traded in shadows, passed in kitchens late at night, wrapped in code. And for those who had once practiced openly, the past was not just painful, it was a warning. One elderly woman in Würzburg, who had once worked as a birth assistant before the trials, was asked in her final years why she had never written her knowledge down. Some women tried to reclaim the work quietly. They volunteered at convents, where medical care for the poor still required hands-on knowledge. The legacy of this silence stretched well into the modern era, and yet the knowledge never fully died. In some Bavarian farmhouses, even today, you can find little bundles of herbs hanging near cradles. They aren't labeled. A quiet echo of the women who once stood between life and death, and who paid the price for standing there too long. Chapter 8. The Role of the Executioner. There was a man in every town like Bamberg who no one wanted to see, but everyone relied upon. He was paid by the city, often housed at its edge, and called upon when justice reached its final, irreversible stage. His hands ended lives, his face was known to every child, and yet when he passed through the market square, people turned away. They did not greet him, they did not touch him. In Bamberg, the executioner's residence stood on the outskirts of the town near the river bend. Close enough for a summons, far enough that no one had to hear the screams or smell the iron. His house was sturdy but spare. No visitors, no garden gossips, just fences and distance. He performed the law's most visible function, and yet he lived as if guilty. The townspeople needed him. They requested his services. His food was sometimes sold to him at a distance, tossed or handed on a wooden paddle to avoid direct contact. In churches, he stood near the back. Confession was complicated. Priests were uncertain how to absolve a man who killed by order. They paid him from the treasury, but still they treated him as if his work might be contagious. Axes sharpened regularly. They were private, a strange form of memory management, perhaps. A way of containing what couldn't be spoken aloud. Ropes kept dry and smooth, but they stayed with him. The executioner could not carry out a sentence unless it was properly recorded and sealed. He could not alter the method if burning was ordered. A town not far from Bamberg, who began having seizures in his sleep after his 12th burning, pulling teeth, setting bones, lancing abscesses. It was a strange overlap. The man who ended life also helped preserve it, but only for those who had no one else to turn to. His wife left him, and once the roll touched your name, it followed your bloodline. Even generations later, families known for the work found it hard to marry outside their own. The past lingered like soot. He didn't return to the city. His home was boarded up. A new executioner was appointed within the month. His neighbors whispered he had become unclean. He retired early and spent the rest of his life as a gravedigger, a job considered more respectable. One scribe noted that the city's executioner requested new boots due to ash damage. The court approved the purchase. No one questioned why the boots wore out so quickly. He could not substitute hanging. He was expected to remain detached, to neither mock nor comfort, and above all, others were haunted. The job wore them down, not with horror, but with repetition. A man can grow used to anything if he sees it often enough. But that doesn't mean it stops hurting, so show no fear. Firewood selected with exacting care. Some kept ledgers of their own, not for the court. He saw the way family members were held back. The way children clutched their father's legs as their mother was led to the fire. But for themselves, small books listing the names, dates, and outcomes of each job. Some included notes like cooperative, resisted, prayed until the end, or died before fire reached heart. Some children whispered that if you got too close, the ground itself would curse you. Others dared each other to run past his window and knock, but no one lingered long enough to see if he ever came to the door. In some places, it was considered bad luck to step into the shadow he cast. They were expected to be efficient, composed, and methodical. Fumbling the rope or blade was not just sloppy, it was offensive. A clean execution was a reflection of divine order. A messy one was seen as a bad omen. He heard the condemned whisper their innocence, not to the crowd, but to him, the one person left. The last witness, one executioner, kept birds. Doves, specifically. A cage of them hung by his window, and villagers passing by could hear them cooing softly. When asked why he kept them, he simply said, "They don't talk." He was the executioner. Or, more formally, the narrator title that sounded clinical, almost administrative, one who sets things right. But everyone knew what it meant. He had a home, though rarely a welcoming one. He did his job, and then he went home, alone. What made the role so strange was its contradiction. He was not allowed to marry into most families. His children were not welcomed at schools or apprenticeships. And yet, in times of need, he was the one they called. Bamberg's executioners were trained, not merely in cruelty, but in precision. Their tools were carefully maintained. These notes were not boastful, and there were rules. But he saw more than anyone. He saw the priest hesitate when blessing the condemned. He saw the faces in the crowd, the curiosity, the hunger, the grief. And sometimes these whispers didn't go into the court record. Not every executioner was cruel. Some took pride in their skill and felt themselves servants of order, no different from a judge or scribe. There is a record of one executioner in Bamberg. The job was not always about killing. Executioners were also expected to perform torture, amputation, and sometimes even medical procedures when no other professional would. Executioners passed their trade down to sons or nephews. It was not a job you applied for. It was inherited or imposed. And yet, the executioner was always there, on time, in uniform, ready. When the trials grew in number, the city leaned on him heavily. Sometimes, several executions were scheduled in a single week. But even this role, so feared, so shunned, there was a limit. One man, whose name appears in only a few surviving documents, reportedly walked away from the post after watching a woman he'd known since childhood scream his name as she was tied to the stake. No charges were brought, but a quiet message was sent. You can leave the job, but not the shadow it casts. The house of the executioner, known in some records simply as the Schinder House, was rarely placed on any official map. It stood far enough from the village court to mark its resident as other, but close enough for the town to reach when needed. Often it was built with thick walls and small windows. The chimney was usually larger than most, built to burn not just firewood, but the remnants of rope, splints, or stained cloth no one else wanted to touch. These homes were isolated by more than distance. They were socially cordoned off by unwritten rules. Children were told never to play nearby. Food was never shared with the family. If a tradesman entered the executioner's home to repair a leak or mend a fence, he did so quickly and accepted payment without touching coin to skin. And yet, the executioner's home was sometimes one of the few places in the region where the poor could find help. In a strange twist of reputation, some executioners, because of their skill with blades and knowledge of anatomy, acted as informal surgeons. They stitched wounds, set bones, and drained abscesses when no physician would come. For the desperate, fear became secondary to need. But even these visits happened with quiet steps and covered faces. Some executioners built private shrines in their homes, not grand or ostentatious, but simple wooden crosses or tiny statues of saints tucked into alcoves. They prayed not for forgiveness necessarily, but for silence, for sleep, for the strength to do what was asked without forgetting they were still human. There are letters from one executioner to his cousin in another city, preserved by accident in a church archive. In them, he writes, "I dream of faces, always faces, never names. They call me brother, but not in the good way. I think I am more seen by the dead than the living." He ends one note with this sentence, "I sharpened my axe today and cried." Despite this, executioners often lived long lives. Perhaps it was their distance from the town, or their access to herbal knowledge passed in whispers. Maybe it was simply that no one dared interfere with them. Whatever the reason, many executioners outlived the very courts that appointed them. But with long life came long memory. One Bavarian executioner in the mid-1600s kept a list, not of names, but of seasons. The winter of 10, the summer of 7, the April with 4. Each title corresponded to the number of executions he performed in that stretch of time. It was, in its way, a calendar of sorrow. A life not measured by birthdays or harvests, but by how many times he stood beside the flames. He recorded each fire's weather. Clear sky, light east wind. Rain began at third torch. Snow fell on the coals, hissed, as though the heavens bore witness in ways the townspeople could not. In one haunting entry, he noted, "The girl looked at me and smiled. I do not know why. I have never hated my hands more." No townspeople attended his burial. When he died, his property was divided by the city, and his house dismantled. The land lay vacant for decades. Even when it was rebuilt, few wanted to live there. One new tenant reported that the walls were unusually cold, and that bread would not rise in the oven. Whether that was superstition or lingering memory hardly mattered. In Bamberg, memory had weight. There were rituals too, quiet ones. Things never written, but always done. The executioner washed his tools in river water after each use. Some boiled the rope to remove the scent of burning. Others left a piece of bread near the pyre site, an offering, a gesture, perhaps a bribe for silence. If a child was executed, and yes, that did happen, though rarely, the executioner sometimes buried a piece of their clothing behind his home. Not for grief, but for protection. From what no one could say, in some towns, local women would sneak to the site after an execution and collect small bits of ash or unburnt straw. These remnants were believed to protect against fever or infertility, a dark echo of folk practices twisted by desperation. The executioner sometimes watched from a distance and said nothing. Everyone had their reasons. One man was known to whistle while working, not out of cheer, but out of necessity. He said silence made the task worse. That melody, any melody, was better than the sound of breathing beside the stake. Eventually, people came to recognize this tune before they saw him. It became a kind of warning. Doors closed. Streets emptied. And when the song stopped, so did the person he'd come for. Some tried to change the role to separate themselves from its burden. They wrote to bishops requesting spiritual counsel, to city councils asking for early retirement. A few faked illnesses or injuries to avoid the worst jobs. But the towns were rarely forgiving. If one man stepped down, another was waiting. Often it was a son, if not an apprentice. Someone always said yes. And so the cycle continued. A job done, a payment made, a walk home in the dark. What's perhaps most haunting is not how the executioner worked, but how he was forgotten. Townspeople remembered the condemned. Their names were spoken in stories, in fear, in scandal. But the man who tied the knot, who lit the fire, his name rarely passed into memory. Even in court records, he is simply marked as the hand, because that's what he became, not a man. Function. And yet, in his ledger, beneath all the strokes and weather notes and marks of fire, there was sometimes a final word scribbled faintly beneath the entry. One word: forgive. No one ever saw it. No one was meant to. But it was there, tucked beneath the fire, beneath the law, beneath the job. A human voice, almost too quiet to hear. Chapter 9. Children who accuse their mothers. There is a silence that falls over a room when a child is asked to speak against their mother. It's not the silence of reverence or grief. It's the kind that feels unnatural, like a breeze that stops mid-step, or a candle that flickers without air. In the witch trials of Bamberg and beyond, this silence often preceded tragedy. Children were not spared from the chaos of witch hunts, far from being shielded by their youth. They were sometimes placed at the very center of accusations, not as victims, but as tools. Their testimonies were used in court, their dreams interpreted as divine warnings, and their confusion shaped into damning evidence. It began, as many things did, with a question, often gentle at first. Has your mother ever whispered to the fire? Did she ever give you something to drink that made you sleepy? Has she ever touched a strange book? Especially in a time when children were raised to obey without question. They were taught that sin hid in every shadow, that the devil walked in dreams, or that a mother might murmur to a pet out of affection. They had the voice of a child, and in that voice they heard certainty, a tactic designed to break both. A child might be asked, directly in front of their bound mother, did she ever tell you to keep a secret? Others invented details, eager to please or simply desperate to leave the room. And the adults around them, whether interrogators or scribes, wrote it all down with grim approval. The ointment, she said, smelled like flowers but made my legs feel light. She was asked how she felt afterward. She replied like flying. Whether she meant joy or something more literal didn't matter. The court took it as proof. Her mother was arrested 2 days later. Or worse, did she ever teach you a rhyme no one else knew? A child who hesitated too long was prodded. One who cried was told, good children tell the truth. Bad children protect witches? A 3-year-old pointed to a basket of herbs and said, that's where the witch lives. It was a game. But someone heard it, and a file was opened. That a harsh word or a bad thought could let evil into the home. Some children remembered. Even years later, you said she floated, once arrested, rarely saw their children again. Some were sent to distant relatives. Others remained in the village, living with the shame of a name that had been blackened by fire. One girl, the daughter of a burned healer, was barred from her school, despite no charges ever being brought against her. A teacher noted in the margin of her record, too many questions. Best not encouraged, didn't you? She called you to the window and told you not to tell your father. Even silence became agreement. Written decades after the Bamberg trials, comes from a man who had been 12 when he testified against his mother. He became a merchant, moved to Würzburg, and never married. In a letter, never sent but found among his papers after death, he wrote, I see her hands in the dark. Not raised in curse, but in bread-making. I remember how she pressed them to my forehead when I had fever. I said she was a witch. I was a good boy. I was trying to be a good boy. And so, when a figure of authority sat across from them and spoke with gravity, they listened. And they answered. Not because of its horror, but because of its heartbreaking sincerity. He was not cruel. He was obedient. A child might overhear an argument and think it dangerous. See their mother cry over an animal's death and believe she caused it. One boy insisted his mother had killed his sister with a single glance. The sister had died of fever, but the boy remembered her sudden stillness. The fear in the house, the way his mother looked afterward, in that world, could be lethal. To his young mind, that was magic. He was trying to explain the inexplicable, even when they didn't understand what they were saying. And then came the suggestion. This somehow was interpreted as proof of witchcraft. They refused to speak. They sat alone in corners, rocking or murmuring. A priest recorded visiting a household where 3 siblings, all under the age of 12, had been questioned during their mother's imprisonment. He described them as quiet as birds before a storm. One had begun plucking out her own hair. Another had taken to sleeping beneath a table instead of her bed. Why? Because the bread was not shared with the rest of the family, and the cat was black. The boy was asked if his mother had ever spoken to the cat. He said yes, and that was enough. It's very important to tell the truth. God loves brave boys and girls. You won't be punished if you just tell us what you saw. Your mother wants you to be safe, doesn't she? Innocence was easy to bend. There is a case in the records of a young boy, 7 years old, who testified that his mother fed bread to the cat before church. The court did not consider that nearly everyone in the village fed scraps to animals. In truth, what they heard was permission. Children were also present during interrogations, sometimes placed in the same room as their accused parent. Many confessed to things they'd never seen. Some told stories lifted from sermons or village gossip. Once recorded, these statements became fact. One little girl, 9 years old, claimed her mother had rubbed ointment on her feet before bed. The girl was brought to her execution, told to watch and pray. Some children, after the trials, withdrew entirely. There was no healing, no understanding that trauma had taken root. The town simply moved on. Not all child testimonies were made under pressure. Some came from genuine fear. Others acted from confusion. And then there were the children who were never given the chance to speak freely. Their words were filtered, reframed, repeated back until they nodded. Parents, and yet one account. That line has stayed with historians. And obedience. After the smoke had cleared and the names had been scratched from church walls, life in Bamberg went on. Markets reopened. Bells rang, school resumed. And among the children who remained, some bore an invisible weight heavier than any shackle, the knowledge that their words had helped end a life. At first, they were often treated as brave. A child who testified was praised as devout, observant, courageous. Priests spoke of them in sermons. City scribes noted their words in fine ink, more carefully than the adult confessions they transcribed by torchlight. Some children were even given small rewards, bread, trinkets, a ribbon for their hair, as if innocence could be purchased back after the fact. But as the trials faded, that praise began to curdle. What had once been celebrated as faith became something else, a reminder, an echo. Children who had spoken now carried names that other children avoided. They weren't teased not openly, but they were avoided in the schoolyard, left alone during church feasts, whispered about during lessons. One girl, when confronted years later with the court records, simply said, "That's not my handwriting," even though she couldn't write at the time. She counted her steps, the stars, the knots in her mother's shawl, which had been kept by an aunt after the trial. She was 5 when she had been asked to describe what strange things her mother had done in the kitchen. A boy who refused to look at fire. A girl who washed her hands raw every morning. A teenager who flinched whenever the church bell rang. These weren't symptoms anyone recognized at the time. But we would now. She told the interrogator that the bread her mother baked never burned, even when left in the fire. It wasn't true. It was just something she had said, something she thought they wanted to hear, not just for a few days, but permanently. He grew up mute, though no physician could explain why. He stood up, barely tall enough to see over the lectern, and said, "I only said it because I was scared." He was 10. Girls grew into women who refused to bear children, fearing they might one day be seen the same way their mothers were. Boys became men who watched their wives too closely, flinched at unexpected noises, doubted dreams, illustrated parables, warned children not to lie, not to accuse without cause. But the irony was never acknowledged that the same adults writing those books had once coached children into doing just that. After that, she never spoke of it again. When she was 16, she went to a convent and took a vow of silence. One woman recalled, in old age, how her grandmother always covered the mirror during thunderstorms, not for fear of spirits, but because her mother once said, "Reflections speak louder when God is angry." She never asked what that meant. Her file lists her as quiet, steady, troubled only in her sleep. A few returned to the churches years later and offered donations in their parents' names. A small candle, a pew repaired. One child, now grown, funded a baptismal font anonymously, with the instruction that it be dedicated to a mother who prayed even at the end. No one asked questions. A vessel for fear. A weapon shaped by adult hands. And when those hands pulled away, the child was left holding something far too heavy for their heart to carry. He worked as a farmhand on the outskirts of the village. Never married, never left. Their stories were buried not just by years, but by silence. And in that silence, shame took root, not always understood, but always felt. The ones who never believed their mothers were witches, who were forced under threat or pressure to say otherwise. They carried a confusion that never quite healed. When he died at 57, he left behind a small wooden box under his bed. Inside were stones, 53 of them, one for each year since the day he entered the courtroom. You could hear it in the tone. Elias was sent to live with distant cousins in Regensburg. He never returned to Bamberg. Decades later, a letter surfaced, written by Elias to a local pastor. In it, he wrote, "My hands have touched many things since that day, coins, horses, tools, but never another mother's hand. Not once, not since. But it lingered like a smell in the corners of a room, unshakable, quietly poisonous." That's the boy who spoke against his mother. She was the one who said her sister was a cat. It was never shouted. Some children learned to pretend they had never said anything at all. When asked, they shrugged. Some claimed not to remember. Others turned to silence. One boy, Heinrich, aged 10 at the time of his testimony, stopped speaking altogether after his mother's execution. Another child, Annalisa, became obsessed with numbers. She repeated that story once more when she was 7 to a visiting bishop. Regret, when it came, did not arrive all at once. It showed itself in strange ways. In dreams, in behaviors that townsfolk called peculiar. Some tried to make amends. The deepest pain, however, belonged to those who told the truth. A court document from 1629 records a young boy, Elias, who recanted his statement during the trial itself. The judge replied, "God forgives truth, not backsliding." His testimony was dismissed. His mother was executed 4 days later. Even in the rare cases where children did not fully understand what had happened, the weight of the trials shaped their identities. Generations were marked. In one town, school books began to include moral lessons about false witness. Even as time passed, traces of the trauma endured. The homes of the accused were avoided. Trees near execution sites were not climbed, and so the echoes continued. There was no healing commission, no ceremony of reconciliation. Just time and the way it quietly rewrapped pain into folklore. In the end, the children who accused their mothers became adults who rarely spoke of their childhoods. A child's voice is supposed to be a symbol of truth, of purity. But in Bamberg, it became something else. Chapter 10, Trial by Water and Other Tests. In early 17th century Bavaria, when someone stood accused of witchcraft, evidence was not what we'd recognize today. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses in the modern sense, no physical proof of any wrongdoing that would hold up in a courtroom today. Instead, towns to trials. Not trials of reason, but of ritual ordeals. They were called holy tests. And no matter the result, the accused rarely walked away whole, if they walked away at all. One of the most notorious was the swimming test, also known as trial by water. It went like this. The accused was bound hands tied to opposite ankles, a rope wrapped around their waist, and then lowered into a river or pond, usually in front of a crowd. The belief was that water, being a pure element, would reject the body of a witch. So if the person floated, the water had refused them, proof of guilt. If they sank, they were innocent, embraced by the sacred element, but might drown before they could be pulled out. There are records of these tests in both Bamberg and the surrounding towns. One entry, dated 1628, describes a woman who was dropped into the old pond before the vesper bell and hovered briefly, then sank beneath. She was hauled out, shivering, declared innocent, and promptly imprisoned anyway. Because the council believed she had bewitched the rope to release her late, the logic was circular. Escape from death became further proof of devilry. Another test was the pricking method. Accusers searched the body for the devil's mark, a spot supposed insensible to pain. A mole, birthmark, scar, or freckle could qualify. The accused was stripped, inspected, and poked with long needles or bodkins. If they didn't flinch, scream, or bleed, the spot was deemed cursed. Of course, in the cold, damp chambers of the Rathaus, after hours of interrogation and trauma, numbness was not unusual. Neither was the use of retractable blades, secretly dulled by those administering the test to ensure a false result. One physician turned witchfinder, writing in a Bavarian manual of the time, advised his peers to search under the arms, between the toes, and beneath the breasts, for there the devil hides his sign. His notes also caution that witches may cry out falsely, and that too much emotion must be regarded as deception. In essence, if you screamed, you were performing. If you didn't, you were guilty. Other rituals took stranger forms. In some villages, bread and cheese were blessed by a priest and then given to the accused to eat. If they choked or vomited, the food had rejected their body. In others, a rooster's feather was burned in a brazier while the accused stood nearby. If they sneezed, it was said the devil was trying to leave their body. If they didn't, the devil had burrowed in too deep. It sounds absurd now, but at the time, each of these signs was interpreted through a dense network of fear, superstition, and confirmation bias. Towns wanted to see witches, and so they found them in every glance, twitch, or rash. In some cases, accused individuals were forced to recite the Lord's Prayer aloud. Any hesitation, stumble, or forgotten line was interpreted as evidence of evil. A woman who mispronounced trespasses was asked to start again. She fumbled again. After the third time, she was marked for torture. Her neighbors had never heard her pray aloud before. That was enough. A farmer once insisted that his wife was innocent because she knew all the psalms by heart. The court responded by making her recite them in reverse order. She couldn't. He was later fined for impeding justice. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these ordeals was the belief that they were merciful. Officials wrote that such trials gave the accused a chance to prove themselves, that God would protect the innocent, that the devil would reveal himself through error, but no one ever stopped to ask why so few survived unscathed. The accused were trapped, float or sink, cry or go silent, flinch or freeze. Every outcome led back to guilt. It was like walking through a maze with no exit, each turn lined with sharpened words and closed doors. And the townspeople, they came to watch. The swimming test drew crowds. Children perched on barrels. Adults stood shoulder to shoulder. Peddlers sold cider and sweets. Some towns treated the events like festivals. A gruesome fair in which the main attraction was a woman gasping in freezing water or flailing against her bonds. People watched with furrowed brows, murmuring prayers while clutching snacks. Not everyone was cruel. Some wept quietly. Others looked away. A few whispered doubts after dark. But no one spoke aloud during the tests. Fear was louder than conscience. The accused sometimes tried to manipulate the tests. A woman might cry out before the needle touched her skin, hoping to trick the examiner into believing she'd felt pain. A man might recite a psalm faster than required, hoping the rush would hide his nerves, but every deviation was noted. Every word that didn't fall just right was copied into a ledger by a clerk with a clean shirt and a blank face. And once your name was in the book, it stayed. Even those who survived the tests were rarely freed. If you sank and didn't drown, if you passed every inspection, if no marks were found, suspicion remained, you had been tested. That meant you were considered dangerous. Towns didn't forget that. You might be released from prison, but not from rumor, not from side eyes at the well, not from children told not to play near your house. The records rarely say what became of those few who passed the tests. They vanished from the margins. Perhaps they moved. Perhaps they faded into the background. But more likely, they lived quieter, lonelier lives from that point forward have ghosts in their own villages. Because survival in a trial like this did not mean restoration. It meant limbo. A life not ended but never resumed. There's a cruel irony that hung over every so-called trial in Bavaria during the witch craze. The more innocent you were, the more likely you were to perish. And even if you endured the pain, the cold, or the humiliation, you were never quite free again. The trial didn't end with survival. It simply entered a new, quieter phase life as the accused who had lived. Take the case of Margarita, a weaver's wife from outside Bamberg, who was subjected to the swimming test in 1629. She was tied at the wrists and ankles and lowered into the edge of the Regnitz River at dawn. The town watched. She sank quickly, water closing over her like a mouth. 2 men hauled her out with long poles, coughing and half-drowned. The officials declared her not proven guilty, but suggested further questioning. She was kept in a cell for 2 more weeks. No charges were filed, and eventually they let her go. But Margarita's shop no longer had customers. Their neighbors stopped speaking to her. Her husband's clients drifted away. Months later, he petitioned to leave the town entirely, writing to a nearby village for permission to resettle. His letter included the phrase, "My wife lives, but not as herself. They think her gills have not dried." That phrase, "her gills have not dried," appears in several documents from that period. It was a cruel joke passed among the townsfolk, implying that those who had survived the water test were not truly human anymore. That they had taken something from the river with them. Something dark? And so the innocent became something more troubling. Reminders. Physical evidence that the process might be flawed. And no one wanted that kind of evidence in their village square. The most twisted aspect of these ordeals is how they were described by those who performed them. Judges, magistrates, priests, they believed the tests were fair, even benevolent. They wrote lengthy defenses of the procedures. One Bamberg judge, Johann Langhans, wrote in 1630, "It is the duty of law to pierce the veil of deception. These tests, ordained by divine understanding, permit the truth to rise or fall as God intends. But truth didn't rise, only bodies did, and even then not always. Some victims drowned before they could be pulled out." This, of course, was considered tragic but not unjust. The town would mourn, perhaps, with a quiet bell toll or a single day's fast, but they rarely saw it as a failure. Instead, they spoke of divine mystery. God's will, they said. Better this than let a witch go free. The psychological toll on the accused was enormous. Imagine the hours between your arrest and your trial. You don't know which test they'll choose. You don't know if your neighbors will speak for or against you. You don't know what your child might say under pressure. You sit in a cold cell with damp straw and a wooden bench, and you try to remember if you've ever said something that could be twisted into a curse. Did you once say your neighbor's cow looked thin? Did you once borrow salt and forget to return it? You replay every moment, every word, and find that even kindness begins to look suspicious in hindsight. Then comes the test. And even if you manage to pass it, by flinching at the needle or choking down the holy wafer or sinking into the water, you come out changed. Everyone sees it, the red marks on your arms, the tremble in your hands, the blank look in your eyes, the fear that you might be called again, because that's the thing they don't tell you about passing the test. It doesn't protect you forever. Records show that some people were tested multiple times, survived once only to be accused again months later. The second accusation came faster, meaner. No one offered prayers for them. No one wept. If you had survived once and were accused again, the assumption was that the devil had grown cleverer since your last appearance. One man, Matthias, a former grain counter in a small Bavarian village, survived the pricking test. No mark was found that failed to bleed. But a year later, when a bad harvest ruined several farms, whispers started again. His name appeared on a list of suspicious personalities, and this time they skipped the test entirely. He was executed 3 days after arrest. His widow, when asked if she had any last words, said, "You already pulled the truth out of him last time. Why do you need his bones again?" Even animals weren't safe. Livestock was sometimes subjected to bizarre forms of trial. A goat that gave sour milk. A chicken that stopped laying. If these things occurred in the home of a previously accused person, the animal might be killed as a familiar, and the owner reaccused. One surviving record notes that a woman's dog howled 3 times when the bell struck midnight, and was therefore stoned as a demon. No one asked what the dog was howling at, or why a person would keep a demon that barks at the hour of church. But that was the logic of the time. If a thing could be feared, it could be punished. And if it could be punished, then someone must pay. And so the trials multiplied. Not always in number, but in repetition, in expectation. A person who's tested once might live in fear for the rest of their life. Every illness, every bad crop, every nightmare could be the spark that reignites suspicion. Entire families became marked. The children, the cousins, the neighbors who spoke too quickly or too slowly. One woman, Gertrude, survived a bread and cheese test but later took her own life. Her note, preserved by accident, was found behind a kitchen beam and read, "My name echoes in every mouth. I would rather be silent." Her village buried her outside the church walls. That was the final cruelty of these trials. They didn't just end lives. They warped the space around those who survived. Trust was drained away like blood from a wound. Even love began to curdle into watchfulness. A husband who had defended his wife one year might doubt her the next. A sister might stop visiting. A friend might stop replying to knocks at the door. Because no one wanted to be the next name on the list. Chapter 11. How the Church and State Collided. In the early 17th century, Bamberg was not just a town. It was a prince-bishopric, a rare kind of state where the bishop wasn't merely a spiritual figure, but also the secular ruler. That meant the same man who offered blessings at the altar could levy taxes, oversee executions, and order military campaigns. In Bamberg, theology didn't just guide the law. It was the law. And at the height of the witch trials, the man behind both pulpit and punishment was Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim. They called him the Hexenbrenner, the witch burner. Dornheim became Prince Bishop of Bamberg in 1623, right in the thick of the Counter-Reformation. The Catholic Church, still reeling from the spread of Protestantism, was intent on rooting out heresy wherever it could find it, or wherever it suspected it might someday grow. For Dornheim, that mission became deeply personal. He believed himself chosen to purify not just souls, but soil. And to do that, he fused faith and force in ways that would leave lasting scars on Bavaria. One of Dornheim's first major projects was the construction of the Drudenhaus, a special prison built specifically for holding and interrogating suspected witches. The building was more than a jail. It was a statement, a carefully designed symbol of control. In its halls were painted Bible verses, iron rings set into the walls, and small chambers that seemed designed for suffering. The very architecture spoke the message clearly. Sin will be extracted, by prayer or by pain. Under Dornheim's rule, the legal system was flooded with theology. Accusations didn't need proof in the way we'd recognize it today. Suspicion alone could spark an arrest. The town's clerks, judges, and constables were expected to act as spiritual gatekeepers. A missed mass might earn you a fine. A forgotten baptism might mark your child as suspicious. Even the way you crossed yourself, too fast, too lazy, too unsure, could be taken as evidence of inner rot. But what made Dornheim's regime particularly dangerous was how smoothly it ran. This wasn't chaos. It was a machine. A system of protocols and paperwork. Warrants, confessions, receipts for firewood, everything documented, filed, justified. There's a chilling kind of calm in the record's entries marked by date and weather, not emotion. On April 24th, 1629, a clerk recorded 4 examined, 3 confessed, 2 returned to holding, 1 prepared for sentencing. Rain in the morning. As if the weather mattered as much as the lives lost. It wasn't just zealotry. Dornheim saw himself as divinely appointed. His letters to other bishops are filled with language that makes no distinction between civic duty and spiritual war. "I am the shepherd and the sword," he wrote once. The wolf hides in skirts and prayers. That line became infamous. It appeared in sermons, graffiti, even etched into a church door in a nearby town. Years later, someone scratched below it, and what hides in robes? To many in Bamberg, Dornheim's grip on power felt absolute. Dissent was dangerous. There are stories of council members who hesitated to approve arrests and who then found their own names whispered in the streets. Some left the town entirely. Others stayed silent. The town's governing body became an echo chamber, each man afraid of being the first to stop applauding. Dornheim wasn't alone in his campaign. He surrounded himself with like-minded enforcers, priests who saw demons in children's drawings, scribes who quoted scripture as legal precedent, torturers who believed every scream was a step toward salvation. Together, they created a world in which normal life slowly unraveled into suspicion. Your neighbor might denounce you. Your priest might question your dreams. Your own child might be called to testify. It wasn't just fear of witches that spread through Bamberg. It was fear of impurity, of error, of being wrong in the wrong way at the wrong time. Even the faithful were at risk, especially them, because true piety, in Dornheim's eyes, wasn't quiet devotion. It was vigilance, the kind that watched others, the kind that made lists. One list survives in the Bamberg archives, a handwritten sheet titled, "Those Who Sleep During Sermons." The names are ordinary: Hans, Petra, Jakob, Maria. Next to each, a mark. Second warning, eyes closed, absent twice. At the bottom of the list is a note: review behavior, consider for questioning. Sleeping in church, a habit, a yawn, a late night. And now, a step toward the stake. The blending of church and state allowed these kinds of lists to become law. There was no second opinion, no higher court. If the bishop believed you were impure, your fate was sealed. Even the nobles of Bamberg were not immune. Dornheim's trials reached upward, targeting wealthy families, former council members, even the chancellor himself. It became a purge masked as purification. And the townspeople, they adapted. Fear teaches quickly. People began to overperform their piety. Loud prayers, frequent confession, eyes cast down, hands clasped tight. Children were taught to report strange behavior, not just in strangers, but in family. Markets buzzed with coded gossip. A woman who once sold herbs now only sold salt. A midwife began including holy water with every birth. Survival required performance. And performance required belief, or at least the appearance of it. Bamberg became a stage, a town-sized theater where everyone played the role of the righteous. And behind every curtain, someone watched. By the late 1620s, there was no longer a clear line between religious error and civic offense in Bamberg. To sin was to break the law, to doubt was to risk exile, and to be accused was to enter a world where innocence had no procedural defense, only silence, confession, or fire. Prince Bishop Dornheim's regime had weaponized theology into something almost administrative. A late tithe payment wasn't just a moral lapse. It was considered a rebellion against divine order. A child born out of wedlock wasn't just a family scandal. It was potential proof of demonic interference. The church's spiritual vocabulary slowly became the town's legal one. Words like blasphemy, heresy, and temptation became legal categories alongside theft and violence. And because theology has no statute of limitations, neither did this justice. Old grudges were resurrected with a new vocabulary. A man who once lost a land dispute might resurface as an accuser, alleging that his opponent had cursed his soil. A widow whose dog barked at passers-by might be accused of channeling unquiet spirits. Even the wind became evidence. If it struck the steeple at the wrong angle, if crops failed despite prayer, if the bells sounded strange at dusk, someone had to answer. One of the most quietly devastating shifts came with the rewriting of municipal charters. Dornheim's council issued revisions to old town codes, inserting religious obligations into secular rules. Residents were now required to confess monthly, regardless of personal practice. Shopkeepers had to display crucifixes in their windows. Teachers were instructed to include lessons on spiritual vigilance, meaning suspicion, into their daily instruction. It wasn't enough to behave. You had to be seen behaving. And if you weren't, that was grounds enough. A man named Lawrence Stein was brought in for questioning after a neighbor reported that he passed the church door without crossing himself. He was a stonemason, likely covered in dust, hands full of tools. He explained that he had simply forgotten. But by then, the wheels were already turning. The court noted that Stein's grandmother had once been accused, though not convicted, that his sister had moved to a Protestant town, that he was often absent from public fasts. These unrelated facts became a case file. He was imprisoned for 2 months and released only after providing names of 2 other villagers who lacked religious zeal. One of those names, a carpenter, was later arrested. No one remembers Stein's stonework, only the chain of suspicion he left behind. In the eyes of the church-state fusion, heresy was contagious. It could be passed in conversation, in childbirth, even in sleep. One woman was recorded mumbling during a vigil. Another was heard laughing during the reading of saints' lives. These became causes for inquiry. Not crimes, but warning signs that something unseen was festering under the surface. And once marked, a person's every action, past and present, could be reinterpreted. This reinterpretation extended beyond individuals to entire families. There are cases of children denied sacraments because a parent had once been suspected of heresy. Properties confiscated not after trial, but after rumors. Even cemeteries were touched by it. Gravestones were removed for the accused. Bodies exhumed. In one infamous case, a woman was burned posthumously. Her remains had been buried for over a year before someone claimed she had bewitched his dreams. The bishop's court ordered her body dug up, burned, and her name struck from the town's records. Her surviving son fled to Wurzburg. His name never appears again. This fusion of spiritual accusation and civic punishment created a system where traditional legal defense became useless. You could not argue that you did not believe in witches. That itself was heresy. You could not suggest the accuser had lied slander against a neighbor was a punishable sin. You could not even claim to have been framed, because the act of denying guilt too forcefully was seen as diabolical resistance. Some townsfolk adapted by adopting a form of defensive piety. They added new rituals to their routines. Women carried sachets of blessed herbs. Men prayed loudly on their walks to the market. Entire families were seen kneeling in front of locked church doors at night, trying to be witnessed in their devotion. The anxiety was not about salvation. It was about surveillance. One letter from a school teacher in 1628, later discovered in an attic in Zeil, reads, "I do not know what is in my heart anymore. I only know what others must see. My prayer is not to God, but to the town. Let them believe I am still theirs." The ultimate danger of Dornheim's rule wasn't just the trials or the executions. It was the slow remaking of thought. People no longer trusted themselves. The boundary between belief and fear blurred, then disappeared. A man might truly believe his neighbor was innocent, but still avoid her, just in case. A wife might hide her husband's books, not because she thought they were evil, but because someone else might. And when everything is heresy, then anything, any twitch, any word, any silence can be a sentence. Bamberg under Dornheim was not unique in Europe, but it was thorough. And that thoroughness created something more damaging than terror. It created normalization. People stopped flinching at the sound of the bell that summoned accused citizens. Children learned not to ask questions. Priests rewrote homilies to emphasize obedience over compassion. The church and the state had become not just partners, but reflections. And when one turned cruel, the other did not correct it. It followed. Years later, when Dornheim fled the town ahead of invading Swedish forces, he took with him several crates of records, testimonies, names, ledgers. He believed he was preserving proof of righteousness. But in doing so, he left behind something even more damning, a vacuum. Without him, the trials collapsed. The scaffolding was still there, the jails still cold. But the machine had no operator. And for the first time in years, Bamberg was silent. That silence was not peace. It was aftermath. A town trying to remember how to think without trembling, trying to breathe without watching its own breath. Chapter 12, The Last Confession and the Final March. She was called Anna. Her surname shifts depending on the record, sometimes Sickler, sometimes Ketterin, but the rest is consistent. Mid-30s, mother of two, skilled in brewing, accused of bewitching a neighbor's infant who later died of fever. Her story is one of the few we can reconstruct with chilling detail because she wrote letters, not in secret, but with permission. Her jailers, perhaps out of piety or curiosity, gave her paper, ink, and a dim lamp, and Anna, knowing she had only hours left, began to write. Her first letter was to her children. Not babies, not grown either. One just shy of 10. The other 7. The letter isn't preserved in full, just portions copied into a clerk's journal. But what remains is enough. I do not walk into fire, she wrote, because I have sinned, but because the world is small and people are afraid. You must grow beyond fear if you are to stay whole. She left them advice to keep warm even in summer, to trust the miller's wife, to avoid sweet wine. There was no drama in her words, no pleading, only rhythm, like a lullaby folded into prose. After the letter, she asked for a priest. Not Dornheim's court chaplain. She refused him. Instead, she requested Father Jakob, an aging cleric known for his soft voice and habit of quoting parables that didn't quite fit the occasion. Jakob came, and they spoke for over an hour. No one knows exactly what was said, but a guard later recalled that Anna did not ask for forgiveness. She asked for mercy for others. She told the priest that her neighbor's grief had been real, even if her accusation was not. This quiet refusal to blame or rage seemed to unsettle those around her. The executioners reported that she did not cry when they shaved her head, that she smiled when given a fresh shift to wear, plain white linen, newly boiled. A woman from the church brought her a small wooden cross. Anna held it in her lap, not her hand. When asked why, she said, "Handshake. Laps are steadier." The morning of the execution began like any other in Bamberg. Bells rang, markets open, bread was baked. And yet, in the narrow streets leading to the Rathaus, there was a hush, a thinning of voices as if the town itself was holding its breath. Word had spread that someone was to be burned. People came early. Some brought stools to see above the crowd. Others came with children, as though this were not death, but pageant. Anna was led out just after sunrise. She had not slept. Not from fear, she told the guard, but because she had dreams to finish. She walked barefoot, as was the custom, her shift cinched at the waist, her arms bound loosely before her. She looked neither proud nor broken, only alert, as though she were taking in details for a memory she'd revisit in some other world. The path from the Rathaus to the square was short, but it passed many doors. At each threshold, townspeople were expected to bow their heads, murmur prayers, or at least look away. Most did, but one man, a baker who had once sold her rye bread, refused to move. He stared directly at her as she passed. She did not return the gaze. At the execution site, a modest pyre had been prepared, stacked alder wood, known to burn hot and fast. Anna climbed the steps herself, without assistance. The executioner, a man named Konrad, read her sentence aloud. He spoke quickly, his voice flat as though reciting inventory. Anna was offered one final chance to confess. Not to her neighbors, but to God. The priest stood nearby, waiting. She shook her head. "I have already prayed," she said. There was no use in repeating what was heard the first time. The next moment came slowly. The ropes tightened. The crowd rustled. Somewhere, a child began to cry, quickly hushed. Conrad gave the nod. The torch was touched to the edge. Fire doesn't roar at first. It cracks, creeps, coils around the base like a curious thing. Then it climbs. Anna didn't scream. She fainted early, whether from smoke or resolve. No one knows. The crowd stood silent until the end. Then they turned and left. What remained was not just ash, but memory. Her story was spoken in kitchens and beside wells for months after. Some said she had smiled in her last moments. Others said the flames never reached her face. A few claimed a bird flew overhead at the precise moment her body collapsed. These were not facts, but comfort small inventions to make the unbearable feel gentler. And yet, Anna's name appeared again, not in an accusation, but in a complaint. Her son, grown years later, filed a quiet petition to the new bishop, requesting a posthumous clearing of her name. He never received a response. But the petition survives. Its closing line reads, "If she was guilty, I am the devil's grandson, and I am not." We don't know what happened to him afterward. What we do know is this: Anna's execution wasn't the largest, nor the most violent, nor the most contested. But it remains one of the best documented because of the stillness in it. The composure, the way she refused to rage, refused to beg, refused even to grant her executioners the gift of public distress. In a time when most were broken long before the flames touched them, Anna remained whole, not untouched, but unclaimed. Her final gift was a kind of disobedience that had no volume, only presence. And perhaps that is why her story endures, not as tragedy alone, but as resistance wrapped in quiet dignity. The day of an execution in Bamberg followed a quiet rhythm. It was not a spectacle in the way we think of modern entertainment, yet it held its place as a shared event, one expected to be attended, reflected upon, and remembered, and not just by adults. Children were often brought by their parents, not for cruelty, but for clarity, to remind them of order, to reinforce what happens when one steps outside the sanctioned lines of belief and behavior. The townspeople rarely debated the guilt of the condemned once the day arrived. By then, the machinery of accusation, confession, and sentencing had already spun too far for doubt to intervene. Whether whispered or roared, suspicion had hardened into law. And the fire waited. Eyewitness accounts survive in the margins of letters, town chronicles, even sermon notes. A cloth merchant named Lucas wrote in his journal in 1627, "There were many today, some from Oberheide and even from Zeil. The weather was fair, the mood solemn. I did not eat until sunset." The lack of detail in that entry is striking, but it's also common. People did not always describe what they saw. Instead, they recorded how the day felt. The unease in the market afterward, the way the wind seemed too still, the silence of children on the walk home. But other records offer more direct glimpses. A visiting priest from Würzburg once wrote, "The woman climbed the scaffold as though to a pulpit. She did not look at us. She looked at the sky. It made me uneasy, how steady she was." I have heard less composure and confession. Even townsfolk who supported the trials sometimes admitted discomfort. One elderly midwife, watching from the back of the crowd, was overheard muttering, "I have seen babes come into the world with more screaming than this woman leaves it." The irony may not have been intended, but it struck others around her. A few crossed themselves. One stepped away. There is something unnerving about stillness in a place where noise is expected. And many executions in Bamberg unfolded with an eerie quiet. The victims often didn't thrash or wail. Whether out of resignation or exhaustion, they accepted their fate with a calm that unsettled more than rage ever could. Children in the crowd were known to ask questions. "Is she sleeping?" One boy asked his mother during a late summer execution. She did not reply. Another child, perhaps older, asked why the flames took so long to rise. An old man nearby responded before the parents could, because the truth is shy. Even now it hesitates. The psychology of the crowd during these moments is difficult to explain fully. For some, attendance was duty, a visible show of obedience. Not to show up might itself be noticed. For others, it was a form of ritual no different from Easter Mass or the planting of spring barley. The town gathered, watched, and processed what they saw through silence, murmured prayers or casual remarks shared over evening stew. And yet, the cracks show. In private letters and unguarded comments, it's clear that many were deeply disturbed by what they witnessed, even if they would never admit it aloud. A baker wrote to his cousin, "I do not look up anymore when the smoke starts. I do not need to. I can smell the end." Another entry, unsigned, found in a household prayer book. "Today I saw a woman burn. She did not look like the devil. She looked like someone I forgot to help. Perhaps the most haunting account comes from a scribe who was responsible for recording names and events during executions. In the margin beside the list of those executed in a single month, he scrawled in smaller script. They asked me to write her name, but I do not remember her voice. Only the way the crowd stepped back when she began to speak. As though holiness might still cling to her skin. These moments, the sudden hush, the eye contact between the condemned and one sympathetic witness, the hesitation of a child offer a sliver of humanity in a process meant to erase it. Because that was the goal of execution day, not merely to punish, but to transform a person into a warning, a life into a lesson. And once the flames did their work, all that was left was ash, stories, and unease. Afterward, the town returned to its rhythm. The fire pit was cleared, the ashes buried or scattered, depending on custom. Children went home with soot on their boots. Markets reopened. Bread was sold. Life moved on, as life always does. But not without residue. Some reported strange dreams in the days after. Others felt ill, though no fever ever came. A carpenter refused to work on gallows repairs. A blacksmith claimed his iron tools hissed when quenched in water. Whether coincidence or consequence, no one asked too many questions. The executioners themselves were a different matter. They did not mingle. They lived apart, often on the edges of town. Their role, though essential, was socially contaminating. You could not shake hands with the man who tied the ropes. You could not share a drink with the one who carried the torch. And yet, without them, the trials had no teeth. One executioner, known only as MG, kept a personal tally of those he burned. In the back of an old prayer book, he wrote 37. One smiled, 4 sang, none cursed. Whether that was meant as a record or a confession is unclear. Public executions did more than remove accused witches. They reinforced the idea that fear was not just common, it was correct. That looking away was safer than speaking up. And that law and faith, when blended too tightly, leave no room for doubt. In the end, the people of Bamberg did not cheer the executions, but they did not stop them either. They watched, they whispered, and then they walked home. And in that slow walk down narrow alleys lined with timber-brick homes and fading light, they carried something far heavier than judgment. They carried complicity. Chapter 13. Survivors and Silent Villages. The fire may have gone out, the bells may have stopped, but in the wake of Bamberg's witch trials, what remained was silence. Not peace, not justice. Just a thick, unspoken quiet that settled into the timber beams of every house, into the seams of every dress, into the mouths of those who had once dared to speak too freely. Survivors did not announce themselves. They did not celebrate. Many didn't even look up when they passed neighbors in the lane. They simply kept going, kept harvesting, kept baking, kept drawing water from the same well where someone else's name had once been whispered. You might imagine that surviving such a nightmare would bring relief. But for many, survival was not escape. It was exile in place. Their lives remained where they had always been, same streets, same fields, but their standing was gone. Their name, once just a label, had become a shadow. A woman named Dorothea returned to her village in 1631. After nearly a year imprisoned without formal charges, her brother had sold half their land to pay bribes. When she came back, she found her garden overgrown and her house cold. No one had lit the hearth. But worse than the disrepair was the way people looked at her. Or rather, how they didn't. She wasn't greeted. No food was brought. At church, the pew where she used to sit was suddenly full. The baker's son wouldn't accept her coins. The miller claimed not to recognize her. She had not been convicted. She had not been burned. But the stain of accusation remained. And in a town like hers, that was enough. Dorothea lasted 3 more winters. Then she vanished. Some say she moved to Würzburg. Others say she took her own life. The truth is unknown because no one asked. Her story was not rare. In the smaller villages surrounding Bamberg, silence became the preferred form of healing. Families who had lost mothers, fathers, sisters, sons, spoke little of it. Not out of strength, but fear. To speak of the dead was to remember. And to remember was to risk, because you never knew who might overhear, who might believe your grief sounded too sharp, too bitter, too restless. A father mourning a burned daughter could not light a candle without someone asking what he hoped the flame would summon. Children learn the rules quickly. Do not ask about the empty house on the corner. Do not mention the woman who used to sing while washing clothes at the stream. If a neighbor cries during Mass, look away. In some households, names were erased from family trees. Not struck through, just omitted. As though the person had never existed. This wasn't done to be cruel. It was done to survive. If you had no sister, then you couldn't be blamed for her sin. If your mother was never accused, then your bread might still sell in the market. People learn to hold memory in strange ways. A man might remember his wife's laugh, but never say it aloud. A child might dream of a brother they weren't supposed to have. Grief turned inward like a root curling around a stone. And yet, within the silence, small acts of defiance still flickered. One farm wife, whose husband had been executed after refusing to name fellow Gevels, continued to set a place for him at the table each year on the anniversary of his death. She never spoke of him, but the chair remained, the bowl remained. Her children knew not to touch it. The neighbors knew not to mention it. In the town of Gaustadt, an entire street was quietly renamed after the trials ended. The old name Flammenweg Flameway was replaced with Heiligenpfad, the Holy Path. Officially, it was said to honor a visiting bishop, but everyone knew. The street had once led to the execution site, and no one wanted that memory lingering in the town's mouth. Some villagers did leave. They packed up what little they had and walked until the road became unfamiliar. These migrants were often met with suspicion elsewhere. New arrivals from Bamberg were watched closely. Were they Catholic enough? Loyal enough? Pure enough? Even when accepted, they rarely spoke of their past. Some even changed their names. Anna became Anneliese. Jaco became Johannes. Reinvention as survival. But for those who stayed, the silence grew thicker with time. It blanketed towns like snow that never melted. Words were swallowed. Stories were lost. And the wounds that couldn't be spoken began to feel imagined, even to those who bore them. One man, whose mother had been burned while he was a child, kept a journal well into his old age. Most of it is mundane weather reports, notes on the barley harvest. But one entry stands out. Written in a cramped, hurried hand, it reads, "I dreamed of her again. She said she was cold. I did not answer. I fear even dreams are watched." This fear lingered generation after generation. Even a century later, in local folktales, witches were rarely portrayed as powerful figures. Instead, they were quiet women, sad women, women who kept to themselves. The stories never ended in triumph. They ended in exile, in silence, and thin trails of smoke vanishing above the trees. A culture of silence is not empty. It hums, it pulses. It holds more than it releases. And in Bamberg and its shadowed villages, that hum remained long after the trials ended. In the squeak of a gate, the uneven step on a stair, the sound of firewood splitting. Even today, some descendants of survivors will shrug when asked about the witch trials. That was long ago, they say. No one talks about that. And yet, the way they say it, the careful choice of words, the averted eyes, suggests the silence is not absence. It is presence, heavy, remembered, inherited. After the fires stopped burning, the ashes didn't simply blow away. They settled into the corners of everyday life, invisible yet ever present. The survivors of the Bamberg witch trials learned to live not with resolution, but with omission. There were no ceremonies, no days of remembrance, no formal apologies. The town never gathered to say, this was wrong. They simply moved forward, or at least tried to, carrying ghosts not on their backs, but inside their mouths, quiet and unspoken. In village after village, rituals shifted. Not in ways that would be noticed by outsiders, but subtly, like a stream changing course after a storm. In some hamlets, people began leaving small offerings at crossroads again. Bread crusts, a coin, a pinch of salt. These customs, long associated with pagan roots, had been condemned during the trials. Now they returned not as defiance, but as something deeper, a form of whispering to the past, to the forgotten, to those no one dared name. Local churches noticed the change too. Confession attendance dropped, but mass attendance rose. People wanted to be seen at services, but feared what revealing too much might bring. Even the priests began to adjust. Homilies avoided the word witch. Prayers for mercy became more general. No one wanted to stir the ashes. In a small village south of Bamberg, a bell ringer named Elias refused to toll the death bell for years after the trials. He told his grandson that every time he pulled the rope, he thought of the woman who had smiled at him before her execution, just once, as he passed with a sack of grain. She hadn't said anything, but her eyes had held something that stuck in his mind. Not terror, not bitterness, just the look that asked, "Will you remember?" He did. He never forgot. And so, for the rest of his years, he left the death bell to someone else. These were not dramatic acts of protest. They were small, persistent echoes. A candle placed without comment. A prayer muttered in a corner. A refusal to speak of certain names after dark. Folklore began to fill the spaces where real memory had become too painful. Children were warned about witches still hiding in the woods, not because the adults believed it, but because the story felt safer than the truth. The truth was that neighbors had turned on neighbors, that parents had accused their own children, that salvation had come not from faith or justice, but from silence or chance. In one family, stories told around the hearth included a recurring figure, the lady in white, a woman in a plain shift who walked through fog but never left footprints. When children asked who she was, the adults only said, "She watches to make sure we are kind." The implication lingered. She had once been wronged. Generations grew up with these kinds of stories. They didn't learn the names of the accused. They didn't read trial transcripts, but they knew instinctively not to gossip, not to speak too loudly, not to draw attention. It became part of the regional character's stoic, reserved, politely distant, not unfriendly, but careful. Even architecture bears the mark of this silence. Many homes built after the 1630s lacked upper windows facing the street. This wasn't just stylistic. It was about privacy, about not seeing and not being seen. Walls thickened. Fences rose. Villages that once gathered nightly on benches outside their doors began to retreat indoors. The public square, once a place of gossip and barter, became quieter, not empty but subdued. And in cemeteries where names carved into stone are meant to outlive memory, there are surprising gaps. Stones without inscriptions, rows with mismatched dates, places where a birth is marked, but not the death. These absences speak louder than eulogies ever could. One tomb in a churchyard outside Zeil bears the carved initials M.N. and the phrase Si Jing Guran, she went before. No date, no surname, just those few words. Local legend says Mam was the daughter of a merchant who vanished during the trials. Her family never acknowledged her formally again. But someone, perhaps a brother, paid for that stone years later, quietly, without asking permission. Sometimes, silence itself becomes heritage. Historians visiting Bamberg centuries later noted this strange absence in oral history. In towns where entire families had been lost, no one seemed to talk about it. Parish records were oddly clean. Diaries skipped certain years. And when asked directly, older residents would simply say, "That was long ago," and then change the subject. This silence wasn't a failure to remember. It was a decision. A wall built around something too dangerous to examine. One wrong question, one misstep, and the past might stir again. Better to keep it buried. But buried doesn't mean forgotten. In the cool shade of the Bavarian forests, where the earth is damp and the moss creeps over stones, there are places where villagers still leave flowers with no name attached, where candles are lit and left to burn out on their own, where a rusted horseshoe might hang from a tree, not for luck, but for protection. No one calls these rituals what they are. No one claims to believe in the old fears, but still they continue, generation after generation. A kind of inherited memory passed not through books, but behavior. And in that behavior is a message. We do not speak of the fires, but we walk a little softer near the ashes. Chapter 14. Echoes in the Bavarian forest. Walk deep enough into the Bavarian woods and you begin to feel it, that quiet tension in the air, the sense that something has been left behind. Not something visible, not something loud, but something old. Something that clings to the trunks of ancient trees, hides behind moss-covered rocks, and stirs only when the sun begins to sink behind the hills. Locals will tell you it's just the wind, or perhaps the wild boar rooting under brush. But if you linger long enough, you'll realize it's memory. The kind that never made it into history books. The kind passed from grandmother to child, and whispers softer than pine needles underfoot. These forests once offered refuge for accused women, for families trying to disappear, for anyone who needed to breathe without being seen. There are places here where no church bells could be heard, where town criers never shouted, and where the long arm of the bishop's law grew too weary to chase. In these shaded glades, stories took root, stories that don't name names, but carry the weight of them. A particularly worn trail near the village of Brighton Buke is still called Hexenfad the Witch's Path. According to villagers, it's where 3 women fled during the height of the trials, vanishing into the undergrowth and never returning. Some say they starved. Others say they turned to the old ways, herbs, prayers to the river and trees. The more romantic versions claim they became guardians of the forest itself, that they walk the path still invisible but watchful, guiding lost travelers away from danger. It's not unusual to find small bundles of twigs tied with string along the trail, or coins pressed into the bark of certain trees. No one claims to leave them, and yet they're always there. Children are warned not to stray from the main roads after sunset, not because of wolves, which are rare, or criminals, who are rarer still, but because of those who remember. A vague phrase, but heavy with meaning. The old ones, the watchers, the not quite forgotten. A farmer named Emil, well into his 80s, once told a visiting researcher that his grandmother would whistle a particular tune whenever passing a hollowed oak near their land. It keeps them calm. She'd say, Emil never asked who them was. He just learned the tune and still whistles it to this day. Near the ruins of a hunting lodge farther north, locals speak of the Red Cloak, a spectral figure seen only during misty evenings in autumn. She doesn't speak. She doesn't chase. She simply stands, watching, always near the spot where an accused woman was once said to have fled her captors and drowned in a shallow stream. No record confirms this event, but few in the village walk that way alone. Not because they believe the story, they'll insist, but because it's better to be cautious. The forest became a container for all the things the towns could no longer bear to name. Guilt, loss, fear. It's easier to turn these into stories than to examine the truth. To say the forest is haunted is simpler than saying our great-grandfathers stood in the crowd and watched a woman burn. Simpler than admitting our ancestors kept their heads down while the smoke rose. The ghosts in the woods are more comfortable than the ones in the family tree. One teacher in a rural school near Tronstadt leads her class on a field walk each year. As they pass into the trees, she tells them the legend of the 3 sisters, women who could speak to birds, heal wounds, and call the rain. They were loved, she says, until they were feared. The students nod solemnly. Some smile. But later, when they return to class, several quietly leave small stones in the windowsill, a habit they weren't taught. A habit that echoes something older. Even the language reflects it. In some dialect pockets, there's still a phrase, zu lies for den Gelgen, too quiet for the gallows. It's used when someone seems withdrawn or thoughtful. But it comes from trial records where judges noted the silence of those who did not beg, did not scream, did not curse. Silence, in those days, could be dangerous. It was seen as unnatural. Today, the phrase remains, hollowed of meaning, but still tinged with something uneasy. Not every village clings to the past in this way. Some have paved their forest trails, opened gas-toffs for hikers, and built small chapels at crossroads. But even here, the stories remain beneath the surface. Ask enough questions at the tavern, and someone will point you toward a stone with strange carvings. A place where the trees never grow quite right. A name that should not be spoken after dark. The forest became the archive for everything too fragile, too frightening, or too inconvenient for public record. And like any archive, it whispers to those who know how to listen. Sometimes that whisper is just wind. Other times, it's the crunch of leaves behind you, even when you thought you were alone. Or the feeling that someone walked beside you just for a moment before vanishing again into the green. If you stop and ask someone in a Bavarian village whether they believe in witches, they'll likely laugh and shake their head. That's old nonsense, they'll say. But ask them why the same candle is lit each year on a certain stone in the forest, and they'll shrug. Tradition, they'll say. But tradition has roots, and those roots reach deep through soil, through history, through silence, all the way back to a time when fear dressed itself as faith, when the forest was not a retreat but a last resort, when fire defined guilt and survival was simply learning not to speak. Long after the fires died down, long after the trial records were tucked into musty archives and the ashes scattered by wind and rain, the fear lingered. It didn't blaze. It simmered. It seeped into daily life, into sayings passed from parent to child, into small rituals repeated without question. In this way, the witch trials didn't simply end. They dissolved into the marrow of village memory, becoming something subtler, but no less enduring. It's difficult to say where history ends and folklore begins. The boundary is foggy like the edge of the Bavarian woods at dawn. Generations blurred it further, not to deceive, but to survive. There's a quiet wisdom in that. Pain isn't always best preserved in exact detail. Sometimes it softens into symbol, into stories of wise women who vanish in smoke, or red-cloaked spirits who warn travelers, or bells that ring on their own in empty chapels. In this way, the trauma of the trials transformed. It didn't disappear. It became folklore, not because it was fiction, but because it needed a new shape. A shape gentle enough to hand to a child, and haunting enough that the child would never forget. Some villagers still mark certain nights with candles on their windowsills, especially during the lean months of winter. Ostensibly, these are for saints or for the Holy Mother. But listen closely to the older ones, and you might hear something more. That light wards off not devils, but forgetting. That the flickering flame is for those who had no grave, no stone, no song. In the town of Hallstatt, a group of women still gather each spring to clean the old chapel that sits alone at the forest. They scrub the stone floor, polish the candlesticks, and leave a woven wreath of herbs and dried flowers on the altar. None of them say why. When asked, they smile and say, "It's what our mothers did, and their mothers before them." It's the kind of answer that contains both everything and nothing. That's how the legacy of Bamberg survives, not just in ledgers or museum exhibits, but in muscle memory. In what people do without fully knowing why, in the foods they eat on feast days, in the corners they don't sweep, in the way they speak in lowered tones when telling stories that involve women alone in the woods. Fear reshaped the very notion of safety. Villages became tight-lipped. Families grew cautious with outsiders. Hospitality was offered, but only so far. Not out of hostility, just habit. You never knew who might twist a word, misread a glance, or remember something better left unsaid. The old instinct still echoes in Bavarian courtesies, polite but guarded, warm but not invasive. Language itself shifted. Phrases like, "too clever for comfort," or "she has the kind of eyes that see too much," sound harmless today. But centuries ago, they were seeds, dangerous ones. To be called wise was to be placed under a lens. To be known for helping others could one day mean you were blamed when help failed. So people learned to be less visible, to blend, to stay just shy of remarkable. And those who didn't, those with the charisma or confidence that once drew admiration, were watched with both awe and unease. It would be easy to say all of this is behind us. That Bavaria, like much of Europe, has moved on, and legally, it has. There are no more trials, no more fires in the name of purity. The old prison beneath the Rathaus is now a museum. The execution square is a parking lot. Children run across it without flinching, and yet, when asked about the trials, some townspeople still lower their voices, still look around before answering, still begin with, I'm not sure if this is true, but my grandmother told me. That's how memory works. It doesn't rely on certainty. It lives in tone, posture, repetition. Even young people who don't believe in witches or curses sometimes hesitate before pointing to a house rumored to be cursed. Just in case, they say with a grin. Then they cross themselves. It's silly, but... And then they change the subject. It's not fear of magic that lingers. It's fear of what people are capable of when fear becomes law. That truth doesn't haunt in chains or cloaks. It haunts in silence, in hesitation, in the knowledge that once, not so long ago, a neighbor's word was all it took. Some of the old forest trails now have plaques explaining their connection to the trials. They're part of local history walks. Guides tell visitors about Georg Hahn and Bamberg Chancellery, about the role of Prince Bishop Dornheim, about the thousands executed across Germany. The tourists nod. Some take photos. Others grow quiet. But the locals, especially the older ones, tend not to linger at those plaques. They've heard it before. Or perhaps they've never stopped hearing it. A woman in her 90s once told a researcher that her mother kept a list of names hidden in a drawer. Names of people from their village who'd been taken, burned, betrayed. I never looked, the woman said. I didn't want to know if our name was on it, not because we were victims. Because we weren't. There's a quiet kind of guilt that survives even when you've done nothing. The guilt of having survived. Of having stayed quiet. Of having looked away. Entire communities carried that for generations, without confession, without catharsis. Just an inherited stiffness in the spine, a caution in the eyes. This story, like the candles in the forest, wasn't meant to frighten. It was meant to remind that fear, once justified by religion or reason or righteousness, rarely stays in its lane. That silence isn't always safety. And that when people burn, something always lingers in the air, scentless, weightless, but undeniably there. So if you ever walk the woods of Upper Franconia and the wind changes, and you feel a strange stillness settle around you, don't worry. It's probably nothing. But maybe, just maybe, it's someone remembering. Someone who never got to speak, and someone still listening. Now the journey is behind us. The fogged windows of Bavarian villages have dimmed to darkness. The chapel doors are closed. The forest paths have grown quiet. The candles have flickered down to little pools of wax, and the last echo of whispered names has faded into the hush of night. You've walked through the market square where eyes once darted and words carried weight. You've sat inside the timber homes where silence lived longer than any prayer. You've followed trails lined with moss, where no signs stand but every tree remembers. And now, slowly, you return from that world, a place where fear once shaped every glance and superstition was stronger than stone. But here, in the present, the air is different. There are no inquisitors, no torches, no tribunal listening for hesitation in your voice. The walls around you are warm and safe. The bed beneath you is soft and still. The roof above you does not watch or whisper. It simply shelters. History, as we've seen, is not always loud. It is often quiet. It settles into rituals, into folklore, into spaces where no one thought to look. It speaks in the way a village skips over a year in its records, in the way a window faces away from the road, in the decision to light a candle without telling anyone why. What happened in Bamberg, in the forests of Franconia, was not some distant event in a land unconnected to your own. It was human, and that means it could happen anywhere people are afraid, where truth is too inconvenient, or where silence is mistaken for safety. But tonight you are not in danger, you're not watched, you are not accused. You are simply resting. The people you met in these stories, Dorothea Elias, the bell ringer, the unnamed girl whose initials were carved into stone, none of them expected to be remembered. Their names were meant to be erased, their memories swept away with the ash. But tonight, through quiet attention, you gave them something rare, acknowledgement. That's a powerful thing, even when whispered, especially when whispered. Perhaps you'll forget some of the details by morning. That's perfectly fine. Let them slip away like mist over the Bamberg hills. Let the crackle of the imagined fire dissolve into stillness. Let the names grow soft, the stories distant, the sorrow settle into a gentle hum. You don't need to carry it. The past has already done that. You only needed to listen. And now the rhythm slows, breath softens. The world narrows to just this moment, this breath, this blanket, this space where nothing is asked of you. No one will whisper your name in judgment. No bells will toll. No fire will rise. Only sleep. Only quiet. The Bavarian forests will keep their secrets. The candles will burn low in old chapels. And the silence passed from grandmother to grandchild will continue its path through time. But you are no longer part of the story. You are drifting away from it now, like fog rolling down a hillside, like a shadow turning to morning. Sleep now. You've heard enough. You've walked far. And what lies ahead needs no words. Just rest. Just peace. Just quiet. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, gently tap subscribe and let the drowsy historian be your guide whenever sleep feels far away. Until next time, rest well, dream deeper, and remember, history is never in a hurry.